Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight we're stepping into a decade that promised everyone a slice of the same dream: matching houses, matching lawns, matching smiles, and quietly asked everyone to pretend the cracks weren't there. This is 1990s American suburbia, where the sprinklers ran on timers and so, it seemed, did the emotions. Before we drift off together, if this is your first time here, welcome to the family. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. A warm thank you to everyone who requested tonight's topic in the comments. This channel exists because of you. Let me know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. If you'd like longer, ad-free journeys to fall asleep to, there's a membership link in the description, completely optional, only if it sounds like something you'd enjoy. And if closed eyes and open ears is more your style, we're on Spotify now too. Alright, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's wonder together for a moment. Have you ever wondered why every 1990s subdivision seemed to be built from the exact same four house plans? Why the phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, haunted an entire generation's driveways? What was actually happening behind those vinyl-sided walls while everyone waved so cheerfully at the mailbox? Whether you could have survived a decade of homeowners association newsletters without losing your mind. Let's find out together. A house like every other house. You've just opened your eyes in 1993 in a subdivision that could be Ohio, could be Texas, could be anywhere the developers had gotten to that year. The houses on your street share the same roof lines, the same builder-grade brick facades, the same three trim colors rotated politely so nobody's home was the twin of the one directly beside it, just close enough to make finding your own driveway a genuine evening challenge after dark. This wasn't an accident. It was a business model. Somewhere in a corporate office, a developer had bought up a stretch of former pasture or soybean field, sliced it into a grid of quarter-acre lots, and handed the whole thing to a construction crew with a catalog of 4 or 5 approved floor plans. The Somerset, the Brookstone, the Willowbrook, names that sounded like they belonged to a minor English lord, slapped onto a house built in 11 weeks from a stack of identical blueprints. You didn't so much choose a home as select a configuration, the way you might pick a trim level on a car, 2-car garage or 3, bonus room or not. Brick on the front only, because brick on all 4 sides cost more than the marketing department believed anyone would notice from the street. The sales office itself was a small theater. A single model home, fully staged, its rooms slightly smaller in reality than they appeared, thanks to a trick furniture buyers rarely clocked undersized couches, narrow dining tables, mirrors angled to stretch a hallway that would, in your actual house, feel more like a corridor in a submarine. A bowl of decorative apples sat on the kitchen counter, never eaten, never real, purely there to suggest a life of easy abundance you had not yet been asked to finance. You walked through, nodded, signed paperwork for a house that in some cases had not been built yet, a foundation poured on faith, 4 walls promised on a timeline that always, without exception, ran a few weeks behind. And when the house did rise from the mud, it rose fast. Speed was the entire competitive advantage of the era's builders, and speed had a cost measured not in dollars but in materials. Real lumber gave way, where it could, to engineered wood and particle board. Solid wood cabinet doors gave way to veneer over pressboard, the kind that swelled the first time steam from a pasta pot drifted too close. Insulation was calculated to the code minimum, and not a stud's width more. You could stand in your new kitchen and hear, with startling clarity, your neighbor's argument, your other neighbor's television, and the specific rhythm of somebody's aerobics tape thumping through a shared wall 2 lots down. The drywall itself seemed almost decorative. Hang a single picture frame with any real weight to it, and you'd learn quickly that the wall behind it was mostly air and good intentions. Color was its own quiet tyranny. Paint chip catalogs offered an entire spectrum, and the entire subdivision chose, as if by unspoken referendum, 4 shades of the same idea: eggshell, almond, bisque, and something the paint store insisted on calling linen that was unmistakably beige. The logic wasn't really aesthetic. It was resale logic dressed up as taste. A neutral house sold faster to the next family, and so you spent your one wild and finite life inside a pallet selected to please a hypothetical future stranger rather than the actual people currently living there. Your home, in a very real sense, wasn't decorated for you. It was staged for its own eventual resale, a for sale sign quietly waiting in the closet from the day you moved in. Here's the strange part, though: you stopped noticing. Give it 3 weeks, maybe 4, and the identical houses simply became the landscape. You learned to navigate not by address but by landmark. The house with the inflatable pool still out in October, the one with the anti-awning that never quite closed all the way, the mailbox that had been backed into twice and never fixed. Pizza delivery drivers developed a specific, weary squint reserved for these neighborhoods, circling twice before guessing correctly, occasionally handing a large pepperoni to a confused stranger 3 doors down who accepted it anyway because, honestly, it was easier than explaining. And you wanted this. That's the part worth sitting with. Nobody was forced into sameness at gunpoint. Sameness was the actual selling point, whispered in every brochure without ever being said outright. To live here was to announce, quietly and permanently, that you were not too much, not too big, not too strange, not too anything. You had achieved a very specific kind of American belonging, one measured entirely in how well you blended into a street where every house looked like it had been printed from the same machine. You had arrived. The machine, for its part, had no particular interest in who you were. The lawn as religion. Step outside now and meet your other, more demanding responsibility, the lawn. Not a garden, not a meadow. A flat green rectangle of Kentucky bluegrass or fescue that asked more of your Saturdays than almost anything else in your adult life, and gave back in return nothing you could eat, sit on comfortably, or show your children the point of. It existed for exactly one purpose: to be looked at, and more precisely, to be judged, silently, by a man 3 doors down named, let's say, Gary, who had opinions about your grass height that he had never once spoken aloud and never needed to, because his own lawn said it for him. The obsession had deep, almost aristocratic roots, borrowed wholesale from English country estates, where a manicured lawn once signaled that the owner was wealthy enough to waste good land on pure decoration rather than crops. Transplanted to a quarter-acre lot in a middle-class American subdivision, the symbolism didn't shrink to match the scale. If anything, it grew heavier, because now everyone on the street was performing the same aristocratic gesture on the same tiny stage, and everyone could see everyone else doing it. The tools alone represented a serious financial commitment. A gas mower, obviously, but that was only the entry fee. Beyond it sat the edger for the crisp military line where grass met driveway, the trimmer for the places the mower couldn't reach, the aerator, rented once a year from the hardware store because compacted soil was apparently a moral failing too, the spreader for seed in fall and fertilizer in spring, and the leaf blower loud enough, some Saturdays, to make conversation across a dinner table genuinely difficult, deployed at 8:00 a.m. sharp by at least 3 households simultaneously, a 2-stroke engine chorus that functioned as the unofficial alarm clock of an entire street. Saturday mornings belonged to the lawn the way Sunday mornings belonged to church in an earlier generation. You didn't sleep in. You couldn't, really. Even if your own mower stayed in the garage, somebody else's was already running by the time the coffee finished brewing, a low mechanical reminder drifting through the window that the grass war had begun without you, and you were, once again, behind. Then came the water. Sprinkler systems, increasingly common as the decade went on, clicked on automatically at dawn across entire subdivisions, an odd synchronized ritual of pouring drinking quality water onto ornamental grass, while the local news occasionally, gently, asked everyone to conserve during dry summers. Some systems ran strictly on timers, with no rain sensor to interrupt them, which produced the almost comic sight of sprinklers dutifully spraying a lawn already being rained on, two separate systems, nature and suburbia, both watering the same patch of grass that had never asked for either. And then, quietly, the chemicals. To achieve that uniform, unnaturally saturated green that passed for a healthy lawn, households applied fertilizers, pre-emergent herbicides and pesticides in a steady seasonal rotation, the bags and bottles often bearing small printed warnings about keeping children and pets off the treated grass for a day or two. In practice, those warnings were easy to miss, easy to forget, or simply set aside. The same lawn treated on Tuesday might have a toddler rolling across it barefoot by Thursday, the same lawn hosting a picnic blanket a week later, the family living its happiest outdoor afternoons directly on top of a chemistry experiment nobody had thought too hard about. The cruelest joke of the whole enterprise was that it never actually finished. A lawn is not a project with an ending. It's a recurring obligation with no final payment. The moment you finished mowing, the grass had already, technically, started growing back, indifferent to your effort, patient in the way only something alive but mindless can be. You would spend years, decades, in some households, pouring weekends and gasoline money into a rectangle of grass, whose only real reward was the brief, temporary absence of criticism. Nobody complimented a lawn that was simply adequate. They only ever noticed the ones that had fallen behind. The committee that ran your life. Which brings us, inevitably, to the people who technically governed your quarter acre, the homeowners association. On paper, the HOA existed to protect property values, a reasonable enough mission stated in dense legal language, buried somewhere in the stack of paperwork you'd signed at closing without quite reading all of it. In practice, it functioned as a small, unelected government, run largely by whoever in the neighborhood had the most free time and the strongest opinions about mailbox placement. The HOA had opinions about nearly everything visible from the street. Your fence height material, and in some communities, the specific approved stain color, chosen from a palette of maybe 8 shades that all landed somewhere between brown and slightly different brown. Your basketball hoop, which in some subdivisions could not be permanently mounted, only wheeled out and back like a piece of contraband. The number of days your trash and recycling bins were permitted to sit at the curb, typically no more than 12 or 24 hours before or after collection, a rule enforced with a precision that suggested somebody, somewhere, genuinely cared. Violations arrived by letter. Not a phone call, not a knock at the door, a formally worded laser-printed letter, mailed to your home, citing the specific bylaw you had apparently broken, along with a deadline for correction, and if you were unlucky, the beginning of an escalating fine schedule. There was something almost eerie about the formality of it. A neighbor 2 doors down had, in effect, filed a small legal complaint against your grass height, and the association had processed it with the seriousness of a municipal court. Every neighborhood, it seemed, had its enforcer, the resident who patrolled not for crime but for infractions, who owned a tape measure and was not shy about using it, kneeling at the edge of your driveway to confirm that your grass had, in fact, crept a half-inch past the permitted maximum. This person knew the bylaws the way some people know scripture, quoted them at block parties, and had, in more than one documented case, laminated a personal copy for quick reference. The monthly or quarterly HOA meeting was democracy at its most exhausted. In a stuffy community clubhouse under fluorescent light, adults who otherwise led perfectly reasonable lives would spend 2 hours debating whether mailbox posts should be permitted in brushed nickel or only in matte black, whether a basketball hoop constituted a temporary structure, whether a holiday inflatable violated the association's seasonal decoration bylaw if left up 3 days past the stated removal date. Voices rose. Binders were produced. Someone on more than one occasion walked out. And the HOA had real teeth behind the theater. Unpaid fines could accumulate, attach as a lien to the property, and in rare but genuinely documented cases, threaten a homeowner's ability to sell or even keep the house. A dispute that began over a hedge height theoretically capable of spiraling slowly into something far more serious. You had, in effect, traded the distant authority of a state government for the immediate, highly local authority of a neighbor named Carol, who lived across the street, sat on the architectural review committee, and had opinions about your gutters that she felt no hesitation sharing. Keeping up with the Joneses. Somewhere on your street lived a family who always seemed to be one step ahead, the newer car in the driveway a season before anyone else's lease was up, the bigger grill appearing in time for Memorial Day, the vacation photos passed around at the mailbox that nobody had quite asked to see. Call them the Joneses, because that's what everyone called them in every subdivision, in every state, at exactly the same time. And the unwritten rule that governed the whole street was simple. Whatever they had, you now required. Not wanted, required. The truth was, the Joneses weren't really one family. They were a rotating role, occupied by whoever had most recently made a purchase visible from the street. One month it was the above-ground pool at the Petersons, triggering a quiet wave of pool consultations up and down the block. The next month it was a satellite dish, a great gray dish mounted awkwardly on the side of a house, promising 200 channels that nobody, realistically, would ever finish watching. And yet within weeks, 2 more dishes appeared on 2 more roofs, financed on payment plans nobody discussed out loud. The competition ran almost entirely in silence. Nobody announced it. Nobody needed to. It lived in glances over the fence, in the slow drive-by scan of a driveway, in the particular way a new purchase registered across a block like a shift in barometric pressure. You'd notice the fresh landscaping 2 doors down, the new siding, the boat parked where a sedan used to sit, and something old and reflexive in the back of your mind would murmur that you were falling behind, that the neighborhood had quietly leveled up around you while you weren't looking. And the escalation followed a predictable, almost comic pattern. It began innocently with a nicer grill, a modest chrome step-up for the patio. But a nicer grill invited nicer patio furniture, and nicer patio furniture eventually suggested a hot tub, and a hot tub practically demanded a gazebo to shelter it, and the gazebo required fresh landscaping to look intentional rather than random. By the time the dust settled, a household might have spent the equivalent of a small renovation, chasing a status competition that existed almost entirely in the collective imagination of 6 or 7 families who were, it turned out, doing the exact same thing to each other at the exact same time, for the exact same reasons, entirely unaware they were mirror images of one another. Because here was the quiet joke buried under all of it: the Joneses weren't actually winning either. Behind their gleaming driveway sat the same anxious math everyone else was running late at night. The new car was leased, not owned. The pool was financed over 5 years. The vacation had been paid for on a card that was still being paid down 8 months later. Everyone was performing prosperity for an audience that was simultaneously too busy performing its own prosperity to notice. It was a hall of mirrors, and every reflection believed it alone was faking it. Opting out, in theory, sounded simple. You could decide status didn't matter to you, that the old car was perfectly fine, that a lawn merely acceptable was good enough. And then a neighbor would casually mention over the fence that they just repaved their driveway, and somehow at 2 in the morning you'd find yourself doing quiet mental arithmetic about whether your own driveway looked shabby by comparison. The game didn't require your consent to play you. It got in everywhere. It was the water the whole street swam in, and there was no drying off. The watchers behind the blinds. Ever have the feeling you were being watched? In the 1990s suburb, you likely were, and the watching didn't require any technology more advanced than a set of mini blinds and a great deal of free time. There was no dedicated security camera on every porch yet. There didn't need to be, because there was a neighbor. Let's call her Linda, because every street had one. Linda saw everything. Linda knew which afternoons the landscaping crew came, and roughly what time your car pulled out each morning, and had already formed several working theories about the unfamiliar vehicle parked outside your house for 2 hours on a Thursday. The surveillance was entirely analog and entirely relentless, powered by curiosity, boredom, and a genuinely impressive memory for other people's routines. The signature move was the blind parting, that subtle two-finger separation of the slats that let a watcher observe the street while remaining in their own mind, completely undetected. You could sometimes feel it, that faint prickle at the back of the neck while carrying groceries in from the car, the distinct sense that somewhere behind a window, a slat had just shifted. And more often than not, you were right. To be fair, the motive wasn't purely nosy. Neighborhood watch culture genuinely believed itself protective, keeping an eye out, as the phrase went, for the unfamiliar car, the open garage door left overnight, the smoke that shouldn't have been there. And sometimes that vigilance did catch something real, but the line between a caring, watchful community and a mild, ambient surveillance state was thin and crossed constantly without anyone quite admitting it. The same neighbor who'd call the fire department without hesitation if your house caught flame would, with equal ease, mention to someone else exactly what time your car left on a Tuesday night and didn't come back until morning. And the watching ran both directions, which everyone quietly understood. You watched them too. You noticed the raised voices carrying faintly from an open window, the unfamiliar car, the police cruiser that idled outside a house for 20 minutes one evening and left without explanation. The entire subdivision hummed, low and constant, with mutual observation, a place where genuine privacy was largely theoretical. Even closing your curtains became itself a small event noted and quietly wondered about. What were they hiding in there? So you learned, gradually and without quite deciding to live a slightly edited version of your life whenever you were visible from the street. You waved when you didn't especially feel like waving. You kept the front lawn immaculate even on weeks when the inside of the house was falling apart, because the front lawn was the part that got observed, graded, and discussed. A quiet, permanent self-consciousness settled over the walk from mailbox to front door, a low hum of being seen that never fully switched off. The commuting father. Now let's follow Dad, though catching him is difficult. He's usually already gone. He left before the sun came up, absorbed into a highway thick with identical sedans, and he won't return until well after dinner, gray-faced, radiating a kind of quiet exhaustion that smelled faintly of gasoline and drive-through coffee. The suburban promise had been space and fresh air, but the fine print required trading 2, sometimes 3 hours a day to the daily grind of the commute. The logic behind it had seemed sound enough at the time. The jobs clustered downtown, where land was expensive and a family of 4 couldn't afford a yard. So families moved outward, further and further from the city center, chasing cheaper square footage into subdivisions carved out of what had recently been farmland. And the price of all that extra space wasn't paid in dollars alone. It was paid in hours, sitting alone in a car, watching brake lights ahead in a slow, repetitive migration shared with tens of thousands of other commuters making the identical trip. The morning departure became its own small, quiet ritual. Dad rose in the dark, ate something standing at the counter, and slipped out before the household was fully awake, already mentally merging onto the interstate before his coffee had cooled. By the time the kids were up, and the kitchen was loud with cereal and cartoons, he was already miles away, part of a slow-moving river of identical commuters heading toward the same cluster of office towers. The commute itself did something to a person over time. It hollowed out the edges of the day and filled the gap with a very specific, low-grade nothing. Talk radio repeating the same segment twice an hour, the same 3 billboards memorized past the point of noticing them, the particular flare of irritation at a merge gone wrong. Dad arrived at the office already a little tired, and arrived home already spent, having given the best hours of his energy to the road itself rather than to either end of the journey. Evenings followed a familiar, almost ritualized shape. Dad would finally pull into the driveway well after dark, moving with the specific slow gravity of someone who had left the better part of himself somewhere on the freeway. Dinner, often reheated by then, was eaten with genuine but limited energy. Questions about the workday were met honestly, if briefly. There simply wasn't much left after 4 hours of driving wrapped around 8 hours of work. Then came the recliner, the remote control, and sleep arriving within minutes, a half-finished plate balanced precariously on his chest. Weekends tried to make up the difference, and in fairness, they often did some real work. Saturday morning cartoons watched together, a game coached, something fixed around the house, the grill finally put to use. But 2 days is a thin bridge across 5, and by Sunday afternoon the looming shadow of Monday's alarm had already begun to settle over the household. He was, by every honest measure, a good father and a devoted provider. The system he was providing within had simply, quietly, arranged for him to be present for very little of it. The Latchkey Kid. Now for the smallest, quietest survivor of the whole arrangement, the Latchkey Kid. That was you most likely, if you grew up in this decade with 2 working parents. Home alone by 3:30, a house key strung on a shoelace around your neck like a small, slightly embarrassing medieval amulet meant to ward off responsibility you weren't quite old enough to hold. Both parents worked. Daycare, especially for older kids, was expensive and increasingly seen as unnecessary. And the prevailing wisdom of the era held that a 9 or 10-year-old, a locked front door, and a bowl of dry cereal added up to more or less adequate supervision. You learned, quickly and without formal instruction, to make yourself invisible until the sound of a familiar car pulled into the driveway. You learned never to answer the phone with your real name, in case the caller had less than friendly intentions. You learned to treat every creak of a settling house as a potential intruder, running a quiet mental inventory of exits and hiding spots without ever quite admitting to yourself that you were doing it. Independence, the adults called it. It often felt in the moment closer to a very specific, very private kind of dread. The math that produced this arrangement was simple and a little sad when you looked at it directly. It had become, over the course of a decade or two, first normal and then simply necessary for both parents in a household to work. That left a gap, the stretch of hours between the final school bell and the sound of a car door in the driveway, during which the household's youngest members were, functionally, on their own. An entire generation was issued a key, handed a short list of rules, and released into the empty afternoon with the quiet, serious responsibility of not getting hurt before dinner. The rules themselves were memorized like scripture. Lock the door behind you and don't open it for anyone under any circumstances. If the phone rings and it's a stranger, don't say you're home alone, say your mother is in the shower, she'll call back. Don't touch the stove. Don't tell friends at school that you have your own key. The entire performance was designed to make the house sound occupied, and the child sound accompanied, staged for the benefit of imagined intruders that, in the collective suburban imagination of the time, seemed to be actively cruising residential streets in search of unsupervised 9-year-olds. The empty house had a texture all its own in those hours, a silence that wasn't restful so much as attentive, as if the rooms themselves were waiting for something to happen. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked a little too loudly. Every settling beam and shifting pipe became, briefly, a possible footstep, a reason to freeze mid-snack and listen with the intensity of a much smaller animal sensing a predator. Most kids developed a rich private inner life composed largely of low-grade vigilance and elaborate, well-rehearsed escape plans, even though the house, statistically and in every practical sense, was almost always completely safe. And here's the strange, complicated truth of it. Mostly, kids were fine. They survived, and more than survived, they learned real skills. How to make something edible out of very little. How to entertain themselves for hours without an adult directing the activity. How to be alone without falling apart. Those skills followed many of them for the rest of their lives, genuinely useful ones. But quieter lessons came bundled in alongside the useful ones. Lessons about what it feels like to be a small person responsible for your own safety before you're old enough to spell the word responsibility. A permanent, low-level alertness to empty rooms that some people carried well into adulthood without ever quite knowing where it came from. Raised by the television. While parents were commuting, working, or simply too exhausted to actively entertain a restless child, someone had to fill the hours. And increasingly, that someone was a large wood-paneled box in the corner of the living room. The television functioned as babysitter, companion, and unofficial moral educator all at once. Children absorbed the shape of the world through cartoons, sitcoms, and a relentless stream of commercials engineered by teams of adults whose entire job was figuring out how to make a small person with no income demand things from their parents with maximum urgency. Screen time, as a concept requiring limits or concern, barely existed yet. If anything, it functioned as a deliberate parenting strategy. Several hours in front of the television kept a child quiet, kept them still, and kept them from asking difficult questions about exactly where Dad went every single day and why he came home so tired. The television occupied a genuine place of honor in the suburban living room. The actual furniture in the room was frequently arranged around it, angled toward the screen the way furniture in an earlier era might have been arranged around a fireplace. Saturday morning held a particular, almost sacred status. It was the one stretch of the week when the airwaves belonged, more or less, entirely to children. Kids would wake early, often earlier than any school morning required, pad quietly to the living room before anyone else stirred, and settle in for a marathon of cartoons that could run 3 or 4 hours uninterrupted. A bowl of brightly colored cereal balanced on their knees, the milk slowly taking on a shade that didn't occur naturally anywhere else. This was the weekly reward, the one uncontested block of freedom. And it was interrupted, every few minutes, by commercials so precisely calibrated to spark a child's desire that resisting them was close to impossible. The commercials themselves deserve their own attention. Teams of marketing professionals, working in offices far removed from any actual child, studied exactly how to make toys look more thrilling on screen than they could ever be in reality, how to make a sugary cereal sing its way into a grocery list. The gap between the toy as advertised and the toy as it actually arrived, smaller, quieter, requiring batteries that were never included, was rediscovered fresh with each new purchase, a small heartbreak that never quite stopped being surprising. The programming itself became its own curriculum, teaching lessons no school covered directly. Children absorbed the rhythm of the sitcom, where every problem resolved neatly within 22 minutes, usually with a hug and a tidy lesson. They absorbed an image of what families were supposed to look like, what a normal household was apparently meant to contain, all of it performed by professional actors on sets considerably nicer than the actual beige living room they were watching from. Real life began, in small ways, to feel like a slightly disappointing rerun of something that existed elsewhere, with better lighting. None of this happened out of neglect exactly. A parent who has commuted, worked a full day, cooked dinner, and managed a household rarely has much energy left to also personally entertain a restless child for hours on end. The television offered something close to a miracle in that context: silence and a contained, safely occupied child. It was the cheapest, most reliable form of childcare ever invented, and it never once called in sick. The mall is town square. If the television was the household's cathedral, the mall was the neighborhood's, the true center of 1990s suburban social life, a climate-controlled promised land of fountains, soft pretzels, and stores that, somehow, only sold candles. Teenagers loitered in loose herds. Parents power-walked its long corridors before the stores even opened. Everyone quietly agreed to pretend the fluorescent lighting was flattering. And yet, even at its cultural peak, the mall was hollow at its core in a way most people sensed without ever quite articulating. It had, in effect, replaced the old downtown, the corner shops, the genuine town square, the actual free public gathering space, with a privately owned building where your welcome lasted exactly as long as you appeared to be shopping. It felt, on the surface, like abundance. In practice, it was often a very cheerful, very well-lit way to feel lonely inside a crowd. The mall itself was engineered, quite deliberately, to separate visitors from their money as pleasantly as possible. There were no clocks anywhere on the walls. There were rarely windows to the outside world. Time itself seemed to stop the moment you walked through the doors, replaced by an eternal, seasonless present lit by the same soft overhead glow, whether it was noon in July or evening in January. You'd walk in for one specific item and emerge 3 hours later, mildly disoriented, holding 4 separate shopping bags, having somehow also acquired a pretzel, a candle, and a shirt you'd likely never wear again. For teenagers specifically, the mall represented something close to salvation, the one place in an entirely car-dependent suburb they could actually reach without driving themselves. You couldn't walk anywhere else. There was, quite literally, nowhere else within walking distance. But the mall could be reached, dropped off at the entrance by a parent with a crumpled bill and an agreed pickup time. Inside its air-conditioned expanse, for a few precious hours, you were more or less free, not buying much, because there wasn't much money to spend but simply existing there, roaming in loose packs, orbiting the food court, performing the ancient adolescent ritual of being seen while carefully pretending not to want to be. The food court functioned as the mall's chaotic beating heart. A dozen competing cuisines boiled down to their greasiest, most sample-friendly essence, someone always extending a toothpick with a small square of teriyaki chicken. The air carried a thick, specific perfume of cinnamon, frying oil, and fountain soda. Teenagers ate standing up or crammed into molded plastic seats bolted permanently to the floor, surrounded by the roar of 100 separate conversations, somehow deeply social and completely anonymous at the same time. You knew almost no one there personally, and yet you were surrounded by thousands. Togetherness, without much actual connection. And past the food court sat the endless stores themselves, each one its own small themed world, the shop that sold nothing but heavily scented bath products, detectable from 100 feet away. The poster store, its narrow aisles a kind of shrine to whatever teenagers happened to be worshiping that particular year. The anchor department stores at either end of the building, vast and carpeted. Their perfume counters staffed by employees armed with spray bottles and very little mercy for anyone walking past. You could, in theory, buy almost anything inside those walls, which meant you were also, constantly and subtly, being reminded of everything you didn't yet own. Look closer, though, and the hollowness showed through the polish. A genuine town square is public and free, a place you can simply exist without justification. The mall was private property from the moment you walked through its doors, and your welcome there was strictly conditional on your ongoing role as a potential customer. Linger too long without buying anything, and mall security would eventually drift over, politely but unmistakably. There was nowhere inside to simply sit and talk without an implied transaction hovering somewhere nearby. It offered every appearance of community, the crowds, the noise, the shared physical space, while quietly charging admission in the form of retail. You went there hopping to feel a little less alone, surrounded by hundreds of strangers doing exactly the same thing, and often left with a lighter wallet and no new connections at all. The little plastic rectangle. Let's talk now about the object that quietly made so much of this lifestyle possible, the credit card. Throughout the 1990s, credit flowed freely. Banks mailed pre-approval offers by the stack. College students received cards before most of them had held a full-time job. And suddenly it seemed almost everyone could afford almost everything, or at least the minimum monthly payment on almost everything. Bigger television, charge it. New patio furniture to finally outdo the neighbors, charge it. The suburb, in a very real sense, ran on the comforting illusion that debt was simply happiness, delayed. The offers arrived like weather, a steady, near-daily precipitation of envelopes promising pre-approval, congratulating the recipient on their excellent credit standing, inviting them to accept a line of credit nobody had specifically requested, and in most cases, didn't strictly need. Each card arrived with a limit that felt, in the moment, dangerously close to actual money, a number whispering that the purchase was possible right now, and the worrying could be handled later. Later was, in many ways, the entire engine of the system. The math was designed deliberately to stay mostly invisible. Nobody advertised the interest rate prominently. What got advertised was the low monthly minimum, a reassuringly small figure that made a four-figure purchase feel like a modest, manageable commitment. Pay just a little each month, the statement gently suggested, and the balance became background noise, a low hum rather than an emergency. What went quietly unmentioned was that paying only the minimum meant, in practice, paying for that same television roughly forever, interest compounding steadily in the background, so that a couch bought once might genuinely be paid for 2 or 3 times over across the following years. The timing of it all was almost cruelly precise. The credit card arrived exactly when the social pressure to spend was at its peak. The Joneses had a new grill, the mall was full of things, the kids needed everything all at once, and the broader culture insisted, cheerfully and relentlessly, that a good life was fundamentally a purchased one. The credit card resolved the tension between what a family actually earned and what it felt expected to own, papering over the gap with plastic. The bill, everyone assumed, would work itself out later. It usually didn't, not entirely. Debt accumulated the way weight often does, invisibly at first, and then all at once. A charge here, a charge there, each one reasonable enough on its own, none of them individually the problem, all of them together very much the problem. Statements grew heavier month by month. The minimum payment crept steadily upward. A particular, quiet dread took up residence in more than a few households, a tightening in the chest when the mail arrived, a subject carefully avoided at the dinner table, a stack of unopened envelopes shoved into a kitchen drawer. From the outside, the family looked prosperous, thriving, keeping pace beautifully with everyone else on the street. On the inside, more than a few were quietly treading water, and the water was rising by the month. Debbie's living room. Beware, too, the friendly little gathering at a neighbor's house, because more often than not in this era, it was a trap dressed up as a social evening. This was the golden age of the home-based direct sales business, where a neighbor, let's call her Debbie, sold plastic food storage containers, or scented candles, or cosmetics, or vitamins, and desperately, warmly, hoped you'd want to sell them too. You arrived expecting wine and a plate of cheese cubes and left, more often than not, holding a starter kit and a vague, uncomfortable sense of financial obligation. It was friendship, gently repurposed into a sales funnel. The invitation always arrived wrapped in genuine warmth. Debbie just wanted a few friends over, nothing formal, just some snacks and a chance to catch up. And you, being a reasonably decent person who actually liked Debbie, said yes, because who turns down snacks and conversation with a neighbor? There was no fine print to read, only Debbie's slightly too bright smile and the phrase, "Come see what I've been up to," which, in the specific dialect of the era, translated more or less directly to bring your checkbook. You'd arrive to find the living room quietly rearranged into something between a birthday party and a small sales conference. Folding chairs set in a loose semicircle, a table draped with product samples under carefully arranged lighting, an order pad resting within easy reach as though it had simply wandered in on its own. And Debbie herself would transform for the evening, no longer simply your neighbor but a woman with a genuine mission, freshly inspired by a motivational tape she'd watched that morning, seemingly convinced this was the night that would change everything. The presentation itself was a small masterclass in gentle social pressure. Debbie demonstrated a plastic container capable of keeping lettuce fresh for what felt like an unreasonably long time. She passed around a candle that smelled, somehow, like a childhood memory nobody in the room actually shared. And woven through the entire evening, smoothly and warmly, was the real pitch that you too could do this. That you too could build something from your own kitchen table if only you signed up tonight. The pressure was social in nature, which made it considerably harder to resist than any pushy stranger on the phone. You could hang up on a telemarketer without a second thought. It was much harder to disappoint a woman who lived 4 doors down, who had watched your children on more than one occasion, whose hopeful expression was now fixed directly on you. So, more often than not, you bought something, not because you needed the container or the candle, but because buying something was, in effect, the price of admission for leaving gracefully. Underneath it all sat the real structure of the arrangement, though almost nobody used the word for it out loud. The actual money wasn't made primarily by selling product. It was made, in theory, by recruiting other people to sell the product, who recruited others in turn, a tapering tower of hope in which the vast majority of participants near the bottom broke even or lost money outright, while a small number near the top did genuinely well. Debbie wasn't a villain in any of this. Debbie had been sold the exact same dream at someone else's living room gathering, by someone else's equally warm smile, and now had a spare bedroom stacked with inventory she genuinely believed in and couldn't quite move. Casseroles and gelatin molds. Let's turn finally to dinner, and try to keep an open mind. The 1990s suburban kitchen ran heavily on convenience. A can of condensed soup, a bag of frozen mixed vegetables, a crushed cracker topping, all baked together into a warm, uniformly beige casserole. And then, of course, there was the gelatin, fruit suspended inside it, vegetables suspended inside it, occasionally things that had genuinely no business being suspended in anything at all. Nutrition, in this equation, took a firm back seat to speed and to whatever promise happened to be printed on the box. The casserole functioned as the true workhorse of the suburban dinner table, and its real genius lay in requiring almost no actual skill, only assembly. You didn't so much cook a casserole as construct one, layering whatever protein happened to be on sale that week over whatever starch was already sitting in the pantry, binding the whole thing together with a can of soup, so processed it might as well have counted as a building material. Into the oven it went, emerging bubbling and uniformly golden, the individual ingredients having more or less surrendered their identities for the greater good of the dish. The broader convenience food economy had, by this point, arrived in full force. Box dinners promised a full meal in minutes. Powdered mixes became sauces with nothing more than water and a reasonable amount of faith. Freezers filled steadily with meals engineered in distant factories, requiring only heat and a modest amount of patience. Cooking, in the traditional sense, had been quietly outsourced to industrial food companies, and what came back was fast, salty, shelf-stable, and designed above all to be sold rather than savored. And then, unavoidably, the gelatin. History has never fully managed to explain it, but somewhere along the way, it had been decided that suspending food inside a quivering, translucent mold represented a genuine high point of culinary sophistication, and suburban kitchens embraced the idea with real enthusiasm. Fruit suspended in gelatin made a certain intuitive sense. But the savory versions followed close behind: shredded carrots, diced celery, small cubes of ham, all floating inside a wobbling dome presented at the neighborhood potluck with unmistakable pride. Guests would approach the buffet table, see it glistening under the fluorescent lights, and quietly weigh whether basic social politeness required at least one spoonful. Usually, it did. Portions across the board reflected a broader philosophy. More was simply better, and abundance itself was the point. This was food designed as reassurance, heavy and filling, a hedge against any lingering memory of leaner times. Vegetables, when they did appear, typically arrived boiled well past the point of any real nutritional value, or drowned entirely in a creamy sauce. Fresh, from-scratch cooking was, in the popular imagination, something reserved for people with considerably more free time than the average suburban household actually had. What quietly got lost in all of this was something harder to name: the idea of a meal as something made with real care and eaten with real attention. Dinner increasingly became a refueling stop, assembled quickly and consumed just as quickly, sometimes eaten standing up, sometimes eaten in shifts in front of the television. It fed everyone adequately and freed up an exhausted parent's evening, and by those narrow measures it worked. But something was traded away in the process. Some thread of connection between the people gathered at the table and the food actually in front of them. What the medicine cabinet held. Let's peek quietly inside the medicine cabinet now, because this part rarely came up at the potluck. Behind the smiling face of the suburban homemaker often sat a small prescription bottle, quietly helping her get through the sameness of the days. The pressure to maintain a spotless home, raise well-behaved children and radiate constant, effortless calm was immense, and the answer prescribed with surprising ease more often than not was something to take the edge off. The expectations placed on her were both enormous and almost entirely unspoken. She was to keep the house genuinely spotless, produce a full dinner most nights, manage everyone's schedules, volunteer at the school when asked, remain endlessly pleasant company, and do all of this while appearing rested and, ideally, appearing to enjoy it. Nobody had explicitly demanded any of this in so many words. It simply hung in the air, absorbed from television, from magazines, from the neighbor next door who seemed, from the outside, to manage it all effortlessly. Though she, too, was managing it the exact same way, with a little help from her own cabinet and a great deal of quiet practice. The days themselves held a peculiar kind of trap, full of constant labor, yet strangely, persistently empty. She was rarely truly alone, and rarely in the company of anyone able to hold a real, honest conversation. The work itself was constant but largely invisible, the kind of labor only noticed the moment it stops, the laundry that somehow reappears, the meals that vanish the instant they're finished, the clean floor already dirty again by noon. The isolation, for many women in this position, ran genuinely deep, each one sealed inside her own beige house, performing the same private marathon, waving to each other cheerfully across driveways, none of them quite admitting how heavy the whole arrangement had become. Into this came the prescription pad, offered by a doctor listening to a tired woman describe her nerves, her difficulty sleeping, a vague and formless unhappiness she struggled to name precisely, and reaching, understandably in many cases, for the quickest available answer. Something to calm the nerves, something to smooth the sharper edges of the day. The medication was legal, prescribed by a licensed professional. Entirely respectable in a way other coping mechanisms simply weren't. It sat in a proper labeled bottle in the medicine cabinet, tucked between the aspirin and the mouthwash, part of the quiet machinery of simply getting through. What made the whole arrangement both effective and, in hindsight, genuinely difficult to look at directly was how well it worked on the surface. With the sharper edges softened, she could smile through the potluck, sit through the HOA meeting, absorb the day's small disappointments without visibly cracking. The performance held. The house stayed presentable. The children stayed fed and reasonably content. The Christmas card, come December, stayed cheerful. From the outside, nobody would have seen anything but a capable woman handling it all beautifully, which was, in a sense, precisely the point. The deepest silence surrounded the subject as a whole. To speak of it openly would have meant acknowledging that the picture-perfect suburban life was, for a great many of the women actually living it, quietly unbearable in ways that weren't supposed to be admitted. So it largely stayed hidden, a private struggle repeated in near-identical form across thousands of kitchens, each woman under the impression she was the only one reaching for the same small bottle behind the mirror. The cocktail hour that never quite ended. Let's pour a drink now, since by this point in the evening, everyone else already has. In the 1990s suburb, alcohol functioned less like an occasional indulgence and more like the lubricant for the entire social machine. There was wine at book club, beer at the backyard barbecue, and a well-stocked bar cart in the living room that got a genuine workout the moment the sun dipped below the fence line. Unwinding after work was practically an unwritten obligation, and the line separating unwinding from something closer to a dependency was drawn very faintly and almost never discussed directly. The drinking itself was woven so thoroughly into ordinary adult life that it had become nearly invisible as a distinct behavior, simply the texture of how grown-ups moved through an evening. The workday ended, and the drink began, a transition as automatic as changing out of work clothes, a small ritual bridge between the stress of the commute and the demands of the evening ahead. Nobody questioned it particularly, because more or less everybody did it, and a behavior common enough eventually stops registering as a behavior worth noticing at all. The social calendar, correspondingly, ran on it almost entirely. Every gathering arrived pre-lubricated in some form. The dinner party had its wine. The barbecue had its cooler of beer. The holiday gathering had its punch bowl, spiked more heavily than any of the children at the table realized. To not drink at a suburban social event was, in many circles, to invite a round of gentle but persistent questioning, as though sobriety itself were the unusual choice requiring some kind of explanation. Book club deserves particular mention here, as one of the era's more beloved fictions. Ostensibly organized around discussing literature, it functioned in practice far more reliably as a sanctioned evening of wine among friends, where the actual book might be mentioned briefly, if at all, before the conversation drifted comfortably toward neighborhood news and an eventual second bottle. Nobody was especially fooled by this, least of all the members themselves, who understood perfectly well that the book was the cover story and the wine was the actual event. The genuine danger tended to hide in plain sight at the very end of these evenings in the driveway. Guests said their goodbyes, climbed into their own cars and drove themselves home along dark, largely unlit suburban streets, having had, by any honest accounting, more than a few drinks. This was treated, almost universally, as a private judgment call, a personal matter left entirely to individual adults who felt, as people in that position typically do, perfectly capable of handling it. Beneath the cheerful clink of ice in a glass sat something considerably harder to look at directly. For some, the cocktail hour that never quite ended wasn't really a social lubricant at all, but a slow, steady dependency. A way of getting through days and marriages and disappointments that had grown too heavy to face fully sober. The culture around it offered almost no vocabulary for noticing this without it sounding like an accusation, and so the heavy drinker and the merely social drinker often stood side by side at the same barbecue, holding the same style of drink, effectively indistinguishable to anyone watching from a polite distance. The fastest network in the neighborhood. Forget any early notion of the internet. The fastest information network operating in a 1990s subdivision ran entirely on telephone cords and backyard fences. A single whispered detail exchanged at the school bus stop in the morning could complete a full circuit of the neighborhood by dinner time, mutating slightly with each retelling, until a fairly minor fender bender had somehow transformed into a full-blown scandal. Gossip functioned as the suburb's true informal currency, traded eagerly and on occasion, spent quite recklessly. The network itself was invisible but remarkably efficient. It ran through the kitchen telephone, tethered to the wall by a cord just long enough to let someone pace the length of the room while delivering the latest update. It ran along the fence line, in the daily back and forth between neighbors leaning over the property boundary comparing notes. It ran through the school pickup line, the grocery store aisle, the driveway conversation that started as a friendly wave and somehow stretched to 40 minutes. Information moved through these channels at a speed that would have embarrassed most modern technology, and it moved with a level of specificity that was, frankly, occasionally alarming. The raw material of the network was, almost always, everyone else's private life, assembled through a mix of direct observation and confident speculation. A moving truck appearing outside a particular house meant, automatically, a story, and the story would be assembled from whatever fragments were actually available, whether or not any of them amounted to real facts. Was it money trouble? Was it the marriage? Hadn't someone heard about an argument, one that a cousin's friend had apparently witnessed firsthand? The gaps in the actual information were filled in enthusiastically by imagination, and the finished version, polished through a dozen retellings, often bore only a passing resemblance to whatever had genuinely happened. The mutation itself was the truly remarkable part of the whole process. A story entered the network as one relatively modest thing and emerged, hours later, as something else entirely. Each new teller adding a small, plausible-sounding embellishment along the way. A car that had simply been towed for expired registration became, several retellings later, a car that had been repossessed, which became, further down the line, a family that had lost everything. Nobody involved was necessarily lying outright. Most people simply passed along what they'd heard with a slight, mostly unconscious upgrade, and the compounding effect of many small upgrades produced a version of events indistinguishable from established fact by the time it reached the far end of the street. And everyone, without exception, was eventually a subject of this network, whether they realized it at the time or not. The stakes were genuinely real in a place where reputation functioned as its own form of currency. The story the neighborhood settled on telling about a particular family shaped, in real and practical ways, whether that family was invited places, whether their children were welcomed at other kids' houses, whether they were considered in the broadest sense to belong. And once a story took hold, it was remarkably difficult to dislodge, since the network had no real correction mechanism built in, only repetition, and repetition alone was often enough to make even a fairly flimsy rumor feel like settled, established truth. When a house went quiet, sometimes in the middle of all that manicured perfection, a house would go quiet in a new and different way. A car would vanish from the driveway one week and simply never return. A for sale sign would appear on the front lawn almost like a small tombstone. The 1990s carried the aftershock of a broader divorce boom that had begun in earlier decades, and the suburb, built almost entirely around the premise of the intact nuclear family, didn't quite know what to do when families quietly came apart inside its identical houses. The signs, in most cases, came slowly and then, all at once, seemed obvious in retrospect. First, the small things, noticed only after the fact. An argument carrying faintly through thin drywall, a strained silence at the neighborhood barbecue, a husband suddenly working later and later most evenings, a wife whose smile at the mailbox had gone slightly brittle around the edges. The neighborhood, ever watchful, tended to sense something shifting before anyone said a single word about it out loud, the way certain animals seemed to sense a coming storm. Then came the confirmation, the moving truck idling in the driveway, the missing car, one parent showing up alone to a school event both had always attended together in past years. The house itself seemed, in its own way, to register the change. A home built and furnished around the assumption of a family of 4 doesn't adjust gracefully to becoming a home for 3 or to a rotating custody schedule. Rooms suddenly felt oversized. The empty side of a 2-car garage became a small, daily monument to what wasn't there anymore. The dinner table, sized generously for the whole family, now sat with a conspicuously empty chair, or was quietly abandoned altogether in favor of eating somewhere that felt less pointed. For the children involved, the new arrangement produced an entirely new geography of childhood. There was Mom's house, and there was Dad's house, and a child moved between the two on a fixed schedule, packing a bag, inevitably forgetting something at the wrong location, maintaining 2 toothbrushes and sometimes 2 slightly different sets of household rules. Kids became, in effect, small commuters ferried back and forth, developing an early, unwanted fluency in adult logistics that most of their classmates weren't yet dealing with. The neighborhood's collective response tended to blend genuine sympathy with a certain undeniable appetite for the story itself. There was real kindness in it. The casseroles that appeared on the doorstep, the offers to watch the kids for an afternoon, the honest warmth of neighbors who understood on some level that this could happen to any family, including their own. But there was also, running alongside that kindness, the familiar machinery of the gossip network quietly humming back to life, assembling its own theories about whose fault it had really been, and what exactly had been going on behind those closed doors all along. What made the whole situation quietly devastating, in a broader sense, was its collision with the entire founding premise of the place. The suburb had been sold as the setting for one particular kind of life, a lasting marriage, children raised in stability, decades shared inside the same well-kept house. Divorce didn't simply end a marriage in this context. It punctured something closer to the neighborhood's founding myth, the reassuring belief that doing everything correctly, buying the right house, in the right neighborhood at the right time, more or less guaranteed a happy ending. Keep it behind the door. Here was the golden, unwritten rule of the whole subdivision, the one nobody actually wrote down anywhere but everybody somehow knew by heart. Keep it behind the door. Whatever went wrong inside a particular house was expected to stay inside that house. Money troubles, marital strain, a teenager quietly going off the rails, a parent slowly unraveling under pressure nobody else could see. All of it got carefully tidied away before the doorbell ever rang. The face presented to the street was pleasant, capable, and entirely untroubled. And maintaining that face was, in its own quiet way, an enormous amount of ongoing work. Appearances weren't simply important in this arrangement. They functioned as the entire currency of local respectability. So people smiled. They waved. They answered everything's great on near-total autopilot, and over time they became remarkably skilled at the performance. It was exhausting, and it was also, in a real sense, fully expected of everyone. The performance itself began the moment a person stepped out the front door and didn't fully end until that same door closed behind them again. In the stretch of space between the front porch and the car, a person was, in effect, on stage, with the entire street serving as a distracted but attentive audience, gathering small bits of material for the informal gossip network described earlier. People managed their facial expressions, their posture, the tone of voice used with children in the driveway, aware, at some level, that a visible loss of temper in public would be noted and discussed. What actually got hidden in practice was nearly everything real. An argument raging right up until the moment guests arrived was folded away instantly, replaced by warm hospitality and an offer of a drink. A stack of overdue bills disappeared into a kitchen drawer. A struggling child's disappointing report card, a parent's private drinking problem, a marriage quietly crumbling, a low fog of depression settling steadily over a household. All of it got swept carefully out of sight, because revealing any of it would have meant admitting the perfect life on display wasn't, in fact, perfect. And that particular admission simply wasn't made, often not even between the two people living inside the marriage itself. Perhaps the cruelest part of the entire arrangement was the loneliness it quietly manufactured. Because everyone was hiding something, everyone tended to assume they alone were hiding it, that everyone else genuinely had things figured out. A family would look across the street at neighbors with a perfect lawn and cheerful waves and think, they've clearly got it together, why can't we manage the same thing? Meanwhile, that second family was looking back across the same street, thinking precisely the same thought in reverse. Two households, each quietly struggling in their own way, each convinced the other was managing beautifully, both too committed to the shared performance to ever break character long enough to discover they were, in fact, treading the exact same water. Fear of the wrong things. Let's talk for a moment about fear, because the suburbs of this decade were quietly terrified of a long list of things that were, for the most part, not actually happening with any real frequency. There were persistent warnings about strangers in unmarked vans, rumors of razor blades hidden inside Halloween candy, claims of hidden satanic messages embedded in popular music when played backward, occasional, genuinely feverish claims about secret cult activity operating out of ordinary-looking daycare centers. Entire neighborhoods worked themselves into real, sustained anxiety over dangers that turned out, on closer examination, to be almost entirely imaginary. The fears tended to arrive in waves, each one gripping the collective imagination with total conviction before gradually receding to make room for the next. There was, first and most persistently, the stranger, the shadowy, unfamiliar figure supposedly waiting to snatch a child off the sidewalk. A danger presented so vividly and so constantly that children were routinely trained to view all unfamiliar adults with automatic suspicion. That the overwhelming majority of harm actually done to children came from people they already knew rather than strangers was a statistic too uncomfortable to fit the prevailing narrative. And so it was, in practice, quietly set aside in favor of the stranger at the curb. The Halloween season carried its own particular seasonal terror, the widespread, deeply held conviction that trick-or-treat candy might be laced with poison or hidden razor blades by anonymous, malicious neighbors. The fear ran strong enough that some parents inspected every single wrapper by hand, and a number of hospitals in various cities offered, for a period, to X-ray candy on request. The actual documented, verified cases of this kind of tampering were vanishingly rare, essentially a kind of shared cultural nightmare with almost no real basis in fact. And yet the fear itself felt entirely real, and feeling real was, in practice, enough to sustain an entire annual ritual of candy inspection. Then came the genuinely more dramatic panics, the belief, held with surprising seriousness in some circles, that popular music contained hidden satanic messages audible only when a record was played in reverse, which sent a number of well-meaning adults spinning records backward at home in search of evidence. The broader conviction that hidden networks of ritual abuse were operating within seemingly ordinary community institutions, swept through respectable communities with real intensity for a period, discussed gravely at kitchen tables, occasionally with serious real-world consequences for people wrongly accused, before eventually collapsing under the weight of its own lack of evidence. The pattern across nearly all of these fears was strikingly consistent and worth noticing. The feared danger was almost always external, dramatic, and largely fictional. The real, statistically significant dangers tended to be mundane and much closer to home: car accidents, backyard pools, medications left within reach in the bathroom cabinet. But those risks implicated the family itself, its own ordinary choices and objects, and it was, understandably, far more comfortable to project danger outward onto a shadowy external villain than to seriously consider whether real risk might be sitting quietly inside one's own garage or medicine cabinet. Marooned in the cul-de-sac. Spare a thought now for the suburban teenager, marooned in a sprawling sea of cul-de-sacs with genuinely nowhere to go and no independent way to get there. Everything remotely interesting was, by definition, a car ride away, and a 14 or 15-year-old didn't have a car. So an entire stretch of adolescence often played out almost entirely in basements, parking lots, and on the bench outside the strip mall sandwich shop, wedged between the drugstore and a shuttered video rental place. The boredom for many teenagers in this environment was profound, almost geological in scale, the kind of stretched, empty time that eventually curdles into something else. Given enough of it, boredom tends to turn into mischief, into small rebellions, into questionable haircuts and louder music, and a general, restless determination to feel something, anything, more intense than the current afternoon. The underlying geography was, in a real sense, working against them. The suburb had been engineered almost entirely around the automobile and the nuclear family, and it had in the process more or less forgotten to account for the person who was too old to be entertained by the backyard and too young to legally drive away from it. For that particular age group, the vast, spread-out, car-dependent landscape became something close to an open-air holding pattern. A friend's house 3 miles away, easily covered by a parent behind the wheel in 5 minutes, represented a genuine logistical expedition on foot or bike, one that, more often than not, simply wasn't worth attempting. So teenagers tended to stay close and, in a sense, stew in place. The available territory was small and thoroughly, repeatedly explored. There was the basement, that dim, carpeted refuge where groups of teenagers gathered to do, in a literal sense, essentially nothing, in the company of other teenagers doing the same nothing, which was, to be fair, more or less the entire point. There was the parking lot, a kind of neutral ground where kids leaned against cars and watched other kids leaning against other cars. There was the strip mall bench, the sandwich shop, the convenience store selling the sodas and snacks that constituted a fair portion of the local teenage economy. The boredom itself became almost a physical substance over time, thick and heavy, filling long afternoons and entire summers with a specific, unmistakable suburban emptiness. Time moved differently when there was genuinely nothing to do and nowhere in particular to go. Hours stretched out. Teenagers memorized the texture of their own bedroom ceilings. They watched shows on television they didn't even especially like, because the alternative was the near-total silence of a subdivision where nothing much ever happened, where the most exciting event of an entire week might simply be a moving truck arriving somewhere down the street. Boredom, as any experienced parent might have predicted, rarely stayed quiet for long. It transformed restlessly into small rebellions, an experiment with something acquired from an older sibling, a reckless late-night drive the very week someone finally got their license, a bit of vandalism born purely out of having nothing better to do on an otherwise empty Tuesday evening. Music got louder and, in many cases, angrier, carrying feelings the environment itself refused to provide any other outlet for. Hair and clothing choices became small, deliberate statements, quiet flags planted in an ongoing, largely private war against the surrounding beige sameness. Underneath the restlessness sat a genuine loneliness that most teenagers would rarely name directly, even to themselves. To be young is, in large part, to want the whole world in front of you, and the suburb, for all its genuine safety, offered mainly a cul-de-sac. It offered protection, which teenagers didn't especially want, at the direct cost of freedom, which they wanted quite badly. They were, in a real sense, being carefully kept from a wider world they longed to get lost in, held gently behind an invisible wall built out of distance and dependence, waiting for a license, a car, an escape that would finally let them go somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't simply here. The basement secrets. Every suburban house of this era seemed to have one, and every suburban house seemed to quietly pretend it didn't exist in any meaningful sense. The basement. Half-finished in most cases, faintly damp, lit by a single bare bulb hanging with a certain resigned quality. It was where a family stored everything it could neither actively use nor bring itself to throw away. An exercise bike slowly converted into a coat rack, cardboard boxes labeled simply MISC. And underneath all of it, a very specific smell, a particular blend of concrete, old carpet, and accumulated time. The basement occupied a genuinely strange psychological position within the broader geography of the home. It was technically part of the house, and yet somehow not fully of it, a below-ground annex where the usual household rules of tidiness and presentation simply didn't apply. Upstairs, everything was staged carefully for company, immaculate and thoroughly beige. Downstairs, the actual, unedited truth of a family's accumulated life was allowed to quietly pile up, out of sight, below the surface in more ways than one. The basement functioned, above almost anything else, as a kind of archive of abandoned intentions. Here sat the exercise equipment purchased in a burst of genuine January optimism, now draped in laundry, standing as a quiet monument to a New Year's resolution that had lasted, generously, 11 days. Here sat boxes never fully unpacked from a move 3 moves back, their actual contents a minor mystery nobody had grown curious enough to solve. Here, too, sat the abandoned craft project, the half-finished hobby kit, the small side business that was, at one point, going to change everything for the family, all of it sharing the same dim space, layer upon layer, like sediment recording a household's discarded plans for who its members had once meant to become. The atmosphere down there was unmistakable, and for anyone who grew up around it, instantly recognizable years later. The basement carried its own distinct temperature, noticeably cooler than the rest of the house, and a persistent dampness that never fully lifted, a moisture that seemed to live permanently in the concrete floor and the aging carpet and the slowly softening cardboard stacked in the corner. And it carried, above all, the smell, that particular basement smell, difficult to describe precisely and yet instantly recognizable, a blend of mildew, dust, and the faint mineral tang of raw concrete rarely touched by sunlight or fresh air. Some basements, beyond the ordinary clutter, harbored genuinely more serious concerns. Radon, an invisible and odorless gas, could seep upward from the ground itself and pool quietly in a home's lowest level, a real documented health hazard that most families of the era never specifically tested for and rarely thought about at all. Moisture over time could breed mold behind wall paneling. Older wiring sometimes sat, largely unexamined, behind the walls of a half-finished rec room. The basement, in this sense, was the literal point where the house met the raw earth it had been built on, and the earth didn't always cooperate quietly. But mostly, for most families, the basement functioned simply as the honest floor of the house, the specific place where the carefully maintained performance finally gave out. Upstairs, the family performed prosperity and contentment for the benefit of neighbors, and in a sense for each other. Downstairs, in the dim light, sat the accumulated physical evidence of a real, imperfect life, cluttered, unresolved, and full of good intentions that had gradually gone soft with damp. The house that wasn't entirely safe. Here's a cheerful thought to drift off to. Your dream home may, in some quiet ways, have been working against you the entire time you lived in it. Older homes in particular sometimes carried lead-based paint, applied decades earlier, gradually flacking onto window sills as the years passed. Some carried asbestos tucked away inside pipe insulation and textured popcorn ceilings. Meanwhile, brand new furniture and fresh wall-to-wall carpet quietly released their own low-level chemical fog into the air. The very same fog most people simply called that new house smell and inhaled, generally, with a fair amount of pride. The story with lead is worth walking through carefully, because for a long stretch of the 20th century it was genuinely everywhere, and almost nobody at the time was particularly worried about it. Interior and exterior paint had, for decades, commonly been manufactured with lead as an ingredient, and that paint coated the walls, trim, and window sills of an enormous number of American homes. As that paint aged, it didn't simply sit there quietly. It chipped, it flaked, and most insidiously of all, it ground itself into a fine dust every single time a window was slid up or down in its frame. That dust settled onto sills, onto floors, and eventually onto the hands of small children, who, as small children reliably do, put their hands directly into their mouths without a second thought. Then there was asbestos, once celebrated as something close to a miracle material for its genuinely impressive resistance to fire and heat, and for that reason, packed liberally into buildings for much of the century. It wrapped pipes. It hid inside ceiling tiles, certain flooring materials, and the textured popcorn ceiling many people stared up at while falling asleep as children. As long as it stayed sealed and undisturbed, it mostly kept its risks contained. But houses inevitably don't stay undisturbed forever. Renovations happened. Ceilings got scraped and updated. Pipes eventually got replaced, and each of these disturbances carried some risk of releasing fibers fine enough to remain suspended in the air for hours, breathed in without anyone realizing it, their potential consequences unfolding, if at all, not over days but over decades. New construction carried its own, considerably less discussed chemistry. Fresh carpet, new furniture, pressed wood cabinets, and particle board shelving all released, slowly and steadily, a low background fog of chemical compounds into the sealed air of a newly built or newly furnished home, the very off-gassing responsible for the widely beloved new house smell. People inhaled it, generally, with real satisfaction, associating the scent with newness, progress, and a certain kind of hard-earned success, rarely suspecting that the pleasant aroma of a freshly furnished room was, in a fairly literal sense, a mixture of compounds steadily working their way into every breath taken in the room. The increasingly sealed, energy-efficient design of the modern suburban home made the underlying issue somewhat worse rather than better. Homes were built to be tight and well-insulated, keeping heating and cooling costs down by preventing air from easily escaping, which also meant the same recirculated air, carrying whatever the house itself was quietly shedding, moved repeatedly through the same ducts and back into the same rooms over and over, day after day. The shimmering blue rectangle. Nothing announced suburban success quite like a backyard swimming pool, that shimmering blue rectangle of leisure that every July also happened to be, statistically speaking, one of the more genuinely dangerous objects a family could own. Toddlers wandered toward water with a fascination that had nothing to do with caution. Gates got left open, sometimes just for a few minutes. Teenagers dared each other into water at midnight when the adults had finally gone to bed. The pool required constant chemical balancing, constant supervision, and a level of attentiveness that a busy household mid-cocktail hour didn't always reliably provide. The pool functioned, first and foremost, as a genuine status object, and everyone on the street understood this without anyone needing to say it directly. To own a backyard pool was, in a real sense, to have arrived, to possess the disposable income, the property, and the leisure time that the entire suburban project had promised as its ultimate reward. On a hot summer afternoon, the family with the pool became, briefly, the destination of the block, the envy of every neighbor who could hear the splashing carrying over the fence and feel, quite plainly, that they were missing out. But underneath the glamour sat a straightforward physical reality, a large volume of standing water in a backyard where children regularly played. Water in that quantity isn't a toy, it's a hazard that never takes a day off and requires no particular malice to cause real harm. A toddler's fascination with water is charming right up until the moment it becomes genuinely dangerous. A gate left unlatched for a few minutes, a moment of adult distraction, one parent assuming another parent nearby was watching closely, and the pool's other, far less pleasant nature could reveal itself silently, without warning, in the time it takes to answer a ringing telephone. The level of supervision a pool genuinely demanded, constant, undivided, and total, was exactly the kind of attention a busy suburban household often couldn't reliably sustain. Parents were tired, pulled in a dozen directions by competing obligations. A backyard party in full swing carried noise and multiple conversations, and the quiet, dangerous assumption that in a crowd of several adults, Surely someone else had eyes on the kids. It was precisely in these moments of divided, assumed covered attention that a backyard pool posed the greatest risk, sitting there calm and inviting while everyone's attention drifted elsewhere. Beyond the ultimate risk sat the relentless, unglamorous daily grind of upkeep that no sales brochure ever emphasized. A pool needed regular chemical balancing, an ongoing, genuinely hazardous process involving chlorine and other compounds often stored, somewhat alarmingly, in the same garage as the children's bicycles and toys. It needed to be skimmed, vacuumed, and filtered on a near-constant rotation. The chemicals themselves could burn skin or lungs if handled carelessly, and they sat in the home in quantities that, viewed with any real scrutiny, might reasonably have concerned a household that mostly chose not to think about it too closely. And yet families kept digging pools, year after year, because the appeal genuinely was that strong, and the underlying danger was genuinely that easy to set aside. The image of a family splashing happily together on a summer afternoon was powerful enough, central enough to the broader suburban fantasy, that it comfortably overwhelmed the more sober statistics about backyard drowning risk among young children. The danger stayed invisible most of the time, the water calm, blue and inviting, the rare tragedy feeling, to most families watching from a safe distance, like something that happened to other people. The zip code that decided everything. Let's talk for a moment about how a family ended up in this particular subdivision rather than another one, because that placement was rarely as random as it felt from the inside. Where a family lived in the 1990s quietly determined a great deal: which public school their children attended, the trajectory of their home's value over time, which doors opened easily and which stayed closed before anyone had even knocked. Entire neighborhoods had been sorted and shaped over preceding decades by forces most residents never examined too closely over morning coffee. A zip code functioned, in a very real sense, as more than an address. It operated almost like a compact code, unlocking or restricting an entire set of downstream outcomes. It determined, in large part, which public school a family's children would attend, and that school shaped a considerable amount of what followed for those children over the following decades. It influenced the trajectory of a home's value, often the single largest financial asset most families would ever hold, rising or stagnating according to forces largely outside any one household's individual control. It served, whether fairly or not, as a kind of shorthand signal to lenders, employers, and insurers, a set of assumptions delivered before a person had said a single word about themselves. This underlying sorting had unfolded over decades through mechanisms rarely discussed at the neighborhood block party, yet shaping it profoundly all the same. Neighborhoods across the country had been mapped, ranked, and divided by earlier generations of planners and lenders, often according to priorities, including, historically, discriminatory lending and zoning practices that don't hold up well under close examination today. The boundary lines on those older maps weren't natural features. They had been drawn deliberately by people, and the patterns those decisions established had a documented tendency to persist and self-reinforce across subsequent decades, quietly channeling who ended up settling where. Public schools made this underlying sorting fairly visible to anyone who looked closely, since school funding and enrollment were tied directly to the neighborhoods they served. Schools tended to reflect, and over time, amplify the sorting that housing patterns had already largely established. A strong school district itself became a feature that raised nearby home prices, which in turn shaped who could realistically afford to move into that district, which in turn shaped the school population. A loop that fed on itself and left unexamined tended to grow more entrenched with each passing generation. The suburb's broader self-image made much of this difficult to see clearly from the inside. The story it told about itself was one of openness, a fresh start available, in principle, to any hardworking family willing to put in the effort to earn its place in a pleasant, well-kept subdivision. And for the families who did successfully make that move, the story genuinely felt true, because they had, in fact, worked hard and had genuinely earned their homes through real effort. What the story tended to leave out quietly was the underlying selectiveness of the welcome. The way the borders had, historically, been arranged such that the path to that fresh start was considerably smoother for some families than for others, in patterns established well before the current residents had ever arrived, and rarely spoken about directly. A landscape built for cars. Try for a moment to walk somewhere in this landscape. Go on. In most 1990s subdivisions, you genuinely couldn't, not comfortably. The suburb had been engineered around the automobile so completely that leaving the house on foot for any practical purpose felt almost like an act of quiet desperation. The grocery store sat a car ride away. The school sat a car ride away. A single gallon of milk required a full small expedition involving keys, a seatbelt, and a garage door. Sidewalks, where they existed at all, frequently led nowhere useful, trailing off hopefully into a drainage ditch, or simply ending at the edge of a busy road with no crosswalk in sight. The entire landscape had been designed with the automobile as its central, unquestioned assumption, and once a person noticed this pattern, it became genuinely difficult to stop noticing it everywhere. The distances between destinations were, specifically, car distances, comfortable enough behind a windshield, borderline absurd on foot. Homes clustered together in their subdivisions. Stores gathered together in distant retail centers, often miles away. Schools, offices, and everything else scattered across a wide, low-density geography that made complete sense from inside a moving vehicle and very little sense to anyone trying to get somewhere on foot. The sidewalk, that fairly humble civic invention taken for granted in older towns and cities, had been quietly abandoned across large stretches of suburban development. In many subdivisions of the era, sidewalks simply weren't built at all, developers having concluded there was little reason to install a walking path in a place where almost nobody was actually expected to walk anywhere. Where sidewalks did appear, they often connected to very little, a stretch of pavement running past a handful of houses before ending abruptly at a busy arterial road with no safe crossing, or trailing off into grass beside a drainage ditch, present in form but not in any real function. The consequence of all this was a fairly specific, almost paradoxical kind of confinement dressed up convincingly as freedom. A family might have a large house, a spacious lot, more physical room than most families in most historical periods had ever enjoyed, and yet genuinely nowhere independent to go. A teenager without a driver's license was, in practical terms, stranded. An older adult who could no longer safely drive found their independence ending abruptly the moment their driving did. A child couldn't easily walk to a friend's house across a busy arterial road with no sidewalk or crosswalk to speak of. The car itself, in this environment, became less a convenience and more something closer to essential survival equipment. Participating in ordinary suburban life without one was, for most residents, simply not realistic. Even the most trivial errand, picking up a single gallon of milk, became a small production involving keys, a garage door, and a drive. Because the nearest place to actually buy that milk sat at a distance, no reasonable person would choose to walk, along roads that offered no safe way to walk beside them in the first place. Behind the gate. For those with a bit more money and often a bit more underlying anxiety, there existed the ultimate version of the suburban fantasy, the gated community. A wall, a gate, a security guard stationed in a small booth, and wrapped around all of it the comforting illusion that danger had been firmly locked out on the other side. Inside, the lawns tended to be even greener, the houses somewhat grander, and the general sense of superiority noticeably thicker than the summer humidity. But the gate, in practice, didn't actually keep out very much at all. Trouble, as it turned out, was perfectly capable of arriving through the front gate with a legitimate resident sticker already on its windshield. The gated community represented, in many ways, the suburb's own underlying logic carried through to its natural conclusion. If the ordinary subdivision already offered a degree of separation from the perceived messiness of the wider world, the gated version offered that same separation reinforced with an actual physical barrier and a guard to enforce it. It was, in essence, the deluxe version of the identical dream, sold on the twin promises of safety and exclusivity. Two things affluent and anxious buyers alike were generally happy to pay a meaningful premium for. The gate itself functioned as the centerpiece of the whole arrangement, transforming the simple daily act of coming home into a small, repeated ceremony of belonging. There was the wall, running the perimeter, quietly declaring a boundary. There was the gate, opening reliably for residents and pausing, at least briefly, for anyone else. There was the guard, often in practice, a somewhat bored figure sitting in a small booth, waving residents through with barely a glance while pausing visitors for a moment longer, a human symbol of the security the whole arrangement was meant to represent. It looked serious. It felt serious. It offered residents a daily, low-level reassurance that they lived somewhere genuinely protected, somewhere deliberately set apart from everyone else. Inside the walls, the broader suburban aesthetic reached its most polished, most curated form. Lawns were tended by professional services rather than harried homeowners with rented equipment. Houses were larger, streets cleaner, the whole environment maintained to a noticeably higher standard than the subdivisions outside the gate. And alongside these elevated surroundings came, for many residents, a quietly elevated sense of self, a sense of having made it not just into the suburb generally, but into its more exclusive inner enclave. But much of the actual security on offer was, in a meaningful sense, theater. The gate and the guard and the wall projected an image of safety, but the genuine dangers that touched most families' lives rarely respected that kind of physical barrier in the first place. Trouble didn't typically arrive from some external, shadowy intruder the wall had been specifically built to exclude. It arrived far more often from inside, from the residents themselves, from the same underlying human difficulties present everywhere else. Strained marriages, financial pressure, substance struggles, quiet private despair, all of it living behind doors that happened, in this case, to sit behind a gate as well. And the wall accomplished something else, something rarely mentioned in the sales materials. It deepened an isolation that already ran fairly deep in ordinary suburban life. A standard subdivision was lonely enough on its own, but at least it remained loosely connected to the surrounding town. A gated community sealed itself off further still, cutting residents off more completely from the ordinary flow of a shared, genuinely public world. Inside, people lived among the taller hedges and grander houses, protected, exclusive, and in a fairly real sense, increasingly alone. Crowded and still lonely. Here's the strange paradox sitting at the very center of all of this. A person could live surrounded by hundreds of neighbors, packed into houses just a few feet apart, and still barely know a single one of them personally. Everyone drove directly into an attached garage, pressed a button, and the door closed behind them, effectively vanishing for the evening. The front porch, once a genuine gathering place for sitting and chatting with passers-by, had largely been replaced by a private back deck enclosed behind a tall privacy fence. A person could go an entire week seeing their nearest neighbors only as a brief wave through a car windshield. The physical density, at least, was entirely real. Houses stood close together, separated by narrow strips of side yard, hundreds of families packed into a relatively small area, near enough to hear a neighbor's mower running or catch the smell of someone else's barbecue drifting over the fence. By almost any physical measure, a resident here was genuinely surrounded by people, embedded in a fairly dense cluster of fellow human beings. And yet actual, meaningful human contact often turned out to be nearly non-existent, the physical closeness producing not real community, but something closer to a kind of crowded solitude. Everyone nearby and almost no one truly known. The attached garage deserves particular blame here, as an architectural feature that seemed, on the surface, like pure convenience, and functioned in practice as something close to a small machine for isolation. A person drove home, pressed a button, and the garage door rose to admit the car directly into the house. They pulled inside, pressed the button again, and the door descended, sealing them into the home without a single moment spent outside, without a single chance encounter on the street with a neighbor who might have said hello. It was entirely possible to come and go for weeks, even months, without once standing visibly in one's own front yard. The gradual disappearance of the front porch told much the same story from a slightly different angle. The porch had once functioned as a genuinely semi-public space, a place at the front of the house where residents sat in the evening, visible and available, positioned naturally to greet passers-by and chat casually with neighbors, a small informal stage for everyday community. The suburban home of this era had, in most cases, quietly retired that function. Leisure time moved instead to the back of the house, onto a deck or patio screened from the street, enclosed by a tall privacy fence that announced, in wood and nails, a clear household preference for seclusion over visibility. What remained of genuine neighborly contact had, in many cases, shrunk down to its smallest possible gesture, the wave. A wave through the windshield as two cars passed each other on the street. A wave across a shared driveway while unloading groceries from the trunk. A wave that acknowledged another person's presence entirely while requiring absolutely nothing further from either party. It was possible to maintain an entire years-long relationship with the family next door built almost exclusively on waves, knowing their car, their general schedule, the approximate ages of their children, without ever really knowing their actual story, their genuine struggles, sometimes even their full names. And the deepest irony of all was that this particular loneliness remained largely invisible, precisely because it looked from the street so much like success. Viewed from a passing car, the neighborhood presented a clear picture of a good, comfortable life, tidy houses, well-kept lawns, two cars parked in every driveway. It had, as the saying goes, excellent curb appeal. But curb appeal, by definition, describes only a surface. Beneath that pleasant surface lived hundreds of families, each one effectively sealed inside its own separate box, moving in and out through automatic garage doors, relaxing behind private fences, connected to the neighbors on either side by little more than an occasional, friendly wave. The annual performance. Once a year, the entire suburban performance reached its glossy, undeniable peak, the family Christmas card. Everyone dressed in coordinated sweaters, arranged carefully in front of the fireplace, beaming as though the previous 12 months had contained nothing but uninterrupted joy. The photo session itself might have taken 45 minutes, involved several increasingly stern threats, and produced at least one child crying somewhere just out of frame. And yet the finished card told a completely flawless story, mailed out to hundreds of recipients who would nod approvingly and, in turn, mail back their own equally flawless version. The card functioned as the annual masterwork of a household's informal public relations effort, conceived, arranged, and executed, in most families largely by the mother, with the determination of someone planning a small military campaign. There would be a theme selected well in advance. There would be coordinating outfits purchased specifically for the occasion, matching sweaters or color-coordinated ensembles that no family member had ever worn together on any genuinely ordinary day. There would be a carefully chosen setting, the fireplace, the decorated tree, a tasteful outdoor backdrop, and it would all eventually come together into a single, polished image representing the family at its absolute, entirely curated best. The actual making of that image rarely resembled the calm serenity of the finished product. The photo session itself was often a small, contained war waged over the better part of an hour, involving a mix of bribery, mounting threats, and slowly rising parental desperation. A toddler refused to look anywhere near the camera. A teenager radiated visible, undisguised contempt for the assigned matching sweater. The baby chose precisely the wrong moment to have a complete meltdown. The father's smile grew visibly tighter with each failed attempt. And somewhere around the 45th minute, in one brief, accidental window of everyone cooperating simultaneously, the shutter finally caught the whole family looking approximately forward with approximately pleasant expressions. And that single half-second became the official record, while the surrounding 44 minutes of chaos disappeared entirely, uncredited, just outside the frame. The finished card told a very specific, very edited story about the year. It communicated wordlessly that the family was happy, thriving, comfortably prosperous. It suggested the children were consistently delightful and well-behaved. It implied a marriage that was warm and a home that was cozy, the previous 12 months unfolding as a gentle, uninterrupted procession of joyful moments. It said nothing whatsoever about the arguments, the financial strain quietly building in a kitchen drawer, a child struggling at school, a slow distance that had opened up between two parents over the course of the year. The card was, in effect, the year itself with all the genuine difficulty carefully removed. Then came the exchange, the broader, almost national ritual of mutual performance. Cards went out to hundreds of recipients, and hundreds of other cards came back in turn, each one carrying its own equally flawless, equally sweater-clad message from another family conducting the exact same operation. Recipients displayed the cards they received, taped along a doorframe or arranged carefully on the mantel, a small private gallery of other people's apparently perfect years, and studied them, compared and felt, almost inevitably, that everyone else had somehow achieved a level of effortless happiness that had quietly eluded their own household that year. Meanwhile, their own card sat on someone else's mantle, producing precisely the same feeling in reverse. The garage of good intentions. Behold the garage, that great cathedral of good intentions, built with the specific purpose of sheltering two cars, and instead, in household after household, pressed into service holding nearly everything the family could neither bring itself to use nor bear to throw away. The treadmill nobody ran on. Bins of holiday decorations for a holiday that no longer felt especially festive by the time it rolled around each year. Boxes of old clothes, half-broken tools, and a tangle of mysterious cords connecting to devices nobody could quite identify anymore. Meanwhile, the actual car, the thing the garage had, quite literally, been built to hold, sat outside in the driveway, exposed to sun, rain, and the occasional hailstorm, because there was simply no room left inside. The irony here was total and across the country, remarkably consistent. A two-car garage existed by its very name to hold two cars. That was its entire stated purpose, the reason it had been included in the original blueprint. And in home after home, it held no cars at all, because the space meant for vehicles had been colonized gradually, inch by inch and box by box, by the accumulated volume of things the family had acquired and never quite figured out what to do with. The cars themselves, the very objects the garage was designed to protect from weather, had, in effect, been evicted to the driveway, left outdoors, while the garage devoted its square footage to sheltering possessions instead. The contents told their own kind of layered story, almost like archaeological sediment. Near the surface sat the most recent additions. Deeper down sat things that had been there so long they'd become essentially invisible, permanent fixtures nobody actively noticed anymore. There were the seasonal decorations, hauled out once a year with real enthusiasm and shoved back afterward with considerably less. There were the tools, some genuinely useful, most sitting dormant for years at a stretch. There were bins of children's outgrown clothing, kept just in case. destined for a future need that, in most cases, never actually arrived. And everywhere the cords, a tangled nest of cables, chargers, and connectors belonging to devices long since discarded, saved on the theory that they might someday prove essential, a theory that almost never panned out. The treadmill, or its equivalent piece of exercise equipment, deserved its own particular place of dishonor, because nearly every garage of the era seemed to contain one purchased in a genuine burst of New Year's resolve, used enthusiastically for a week or two, and then quietly, gradually retired to the garage, where it slowly transformed into an extremely expensive shelf, draped in coats and cardboard boxes. It couldn't easily be used again, because using it would require excavating it from underneath everything else. It couldn't easily be discarded either, because discarding it would mean quietly admitting defeat. So it stayed exactly where it was, gathering dust indefinitely. The garage was, above almost everything else, a fairly honest physical ledger of consumption, the accumulated, undeniable evidence of a broader culture that bought constantly and released comparatively little. Every impulse purchase, every gadget that had seemed genuinely essential in the store and turned out to be largely useless once it got home, everything acquired to fill some brief, passing want eventually found its way here, added quietly to the pile. And presiding over all of it sat the same eternal promise, renewed faithfully every spring and almost never kept, that this year, finally, the garage would get properly cleaned out. Spring came. Spring went. The garage, more often than not, remained just as full as the year before, the car still parked outside in the driveway, waiting patiently for a reckoning that rarely arrived on schedule. The Millennium Panic. As the decade wound down toward its close, a new and unusual dread crept quietly into the beige comfort of suburban life. The arrival of the year 2000. Word spread, gradually and then quite rapidly, that at the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve, computers around the world might misread the new date entirely, with potentially serious consequences for banking systems, power grids, and other infrastructure that had come to depend heavily on computerized systems. Suddenly, more than a few neighbors were quietly stockpiling canned goods and bottled water in that same overflowing garage. Generators appeared in driveways. Contingency plans were drawn up. The same suburb that had spent years worrying about strangers in vans and razor blades in candy now turned its considerable capacity for worry toward a calendar. The root of the concern was, in fact, a genuine and reasonably well-documented technical issue. For decades, to conserve limited computer memory in an earlier era of computing, programmers had commonly recorded calendar years using only their final 2 digits, so that 1999, inside many older systems, was stored simply as 99. This shortcut had worked without incident for a very long time. But as the actual year 2000 approached, a legitimate concern took hold within the technology industry. When the internal count rolled over, certain systems might interpret the new, not as the year 2000, but as 1900, with unpredictable downstream effects across a vast, interconnected web of systems that, by this point, quietly ran much of modern daily life. That underlying concern had a genuine technical basis, and the software and infrastructure industries spent a significant amount of time and money over the preceding several years auditing and updating vulnerable systems specifically to address it. What followed in the broader public imagination, though, was the suburb doing precisely what it tended to do best with any credible-sounding threat, amplifying it considerably. The predicted consequences grew more dramatic with each retelling, the familiar neighborhood gossip network doing its usual work of steady exaggeration. Reasonable, technically grounded concerns about certain banking and utility systems escalated, mouth to mouth, into far more sweeping predictions of planes falling from the sky, banks losing everyone's savings outright, and the broader power grid failing entirely. The preparations that followed were, in more than a few neighborhoods, genuinely extensive, and they tended to flow naturally into the garage alongside everything else already stored there. Cases of bottled water, shelves of canned goods, purchased well in advance. Generators bought and carefully tested ahead of time. Some households withdrew extra cash from the bank, on the theory that ATMs or the banking system itself might not function reliably in the early days of the new year. A number of families made genuinely detailed contingency plans for where they'd go and how they'd manage if the power did, in fact, go out for an extended stretch. The tension built steadily as New Year's Eve approached, with a good portion of the country uncertain whether it was gathering to celebrate or, in a real sense, bracing for something considerably more serious. And then the clock struck midnight, and for the vast majority of ordinary households, essentially nothing happened. The date rolled over cleanly. The lights stayed on. Planes continued flying without incident. Banks opened for business the following morning exactly as they always had. The widely feared catastrophe simply failed to materialize in any meaningful way for most people, and the country woke up on the first morning of the new millennium to find itself fully intact, a little sheepish, and sitting on a genuinely impressive quantity of unopened canned goods. A deeper look: fashion, video games, and the family minivan. Let's slow down for a moment and step into a few more corners of this decade before we bring things to a close, because there's more still worth wandering through together tonight. Consider the family minivan, that boxy, sliding-door workhorse that had, by the early 90s, quietly replaced the station wagon as the definitive vehicle of suburban parenthood. It carried soccer cleats and juice boxes, and on a bad day, the specific smell of spilled apple juice that never fully left the upholstery no matter how many times it was cleaned. Buying a minivan was, for many parents, a small private admission that a certain chapter of youth had closed. Nobody dreamed, as a teenager, of one day owning a minivan, and yet nearly everyone with more than one child under the age of 10 eventually found themselves behind its wheel, gradually adjusting to the identity of the person who drives the minivan. Ferrying children between soccer practice, piano lessons, and a friend's birthday party, sometimes all three in a single Saturday afternoon. Inside those minivans, and inside suburban bedrooms across the country, video game consoles were steadily reshaping how children spent their indoor hours. Early in the decade, 16-bit systems dominated after-school afternoons, their cartridges traded eagerly among neighborhood kids the way earlier generations might have traded baseball cards. By the middle and later years of the decade, three-dimensional graphics arrived and genuinely startled a generation raised on flat, side-scrolling worlds. Parents, for their part, tended to view the growing hours spent in front of a game console with a familiar mixture of relief. It kept a restless child quiet and contained, much like television before it, and a vague, not quite formed unease about what, exactly, all that screen time might be doing. Fashion, meanwhile, moved through the decade in its own distinct waves. Early on, oversized silhouettes dominated baggy jeans, enormous flannel shirts borrowed loosely from grunge culture filtering down from cities into suburban shopping mall storefronts. Neon colors and bold geometric patterns had their own earlier moment before fadding. Mall clothing stores became, for many teenagers, a genuine site of identity formation, a fairly small, curated selection of brands that, worn correctly, signaled belonging to one social group or another, an entire adolescent social hierarchy sorted out in aisles of pre-ripped denim and screen-printed t-shirts. The suburban home shopping channel deserves its own brief mention. 2 hours of televised jewelry, kitchen gadgets, and exercise equipment sold directly into living rooms through a hypnotic, unbroken stream of commentary, credit card numbers read aloud over the phone late into the evening by a parent who told themselves, quite sincerely, that this particular purchase was the one that would finally simplify things. The PTA and the politics of the school hallway. Let's step inside the elementary school for a moment, because suburban childhood in this decade ran on a schedule almost as rigid as any office job, and the building itself carried its own quiet social order. The Parent-Teacher Association meeting, held most months in the school cafeteria under the same unflattering fluorescent lighting that governed every other suburban meeting of the era, functioned as its own small arena of influence. A handful of especially dedicated mothers. It was, in the overwhelming majority of cases, mothers ran the bake sales, organized the school carnival, decided which fundraiser theme would grace the spring gala, and in the process accumulated a specific kind of informal social capital that had very little to do with any job title and everything to do with hours volunteered. The classroom itself carried its own quiet economy. Birthday parties became small, unspoken tests of social standing, a class of 25 children, and an invitation list that inevitably excluded a few, information that traveled through the playground grapevine with startling speed and occasional cruelty. Packed lunches, carried in increasingly elaborate character-branded lunch boxes, became a visible marker of what a family could or couldn't afford, sorted out silently at cafeteria tables long before children had the vocabulary to describe what they were noticing. The wrong shoes, the wrong backpack, the absence of the one toy everyone else seemed to have, small things, individually, that accumulated into a child's early, often painful education in where exactly their family sat relative to everyone else's. Standardized testing had begun creeping more firmly into the school calendar by this point, and with it came a new, low-grade anxiety threaded through the spring semester. Scores, results, and, increasingly, comparisons between schools and school districts became a quiet undercurrent in parent conversations, another data point feeding back into the zip code sorting described earlier, another reason a family might stretch their budget to afford a house zoned for one elementary school over another just a few miles away. Teachers, for their part, navigated a school year with considerably less institutional support than they'd have liked, and in many buildings, a genuinely overcrowded classroom of 25 or 30 children. Parent volunteers filled real, necessary gaps, chaperoning field trips to the Science Museum, running the school library's circulation desk on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, organizing the annual holiday pageant that every parent attended armed with a camcorder the approximate size of a toaster. Summer vacation and the family road trip. Summer arrived each year with its own set of rituals, chief among them the family road trip, a station wagon or, increasingly by mid-decade, a minivan loaded well past its intended capacity, pointed toward a destination that was, more often than not, somewhere within a day or two's drive rather than requiring an airplane. Airfare for a family of 4 or 5 was, for a great many suburban households, simply not in the annual budget, and so summer travel meant highways, interstate rest stops, and the particular boredom of a back seat with no individual screens, no tablets, nothing beyond a road atlas spread across a parent's lap, and a game of counting out-of-state license plates that could, with genuine effort, occupy a restless child for a solid hour. The destinations themselves followed familiar, well-worn patterns. A national park, visited briefly and photographed extensively. A relative's house several states away, the visit itself doubling as a chance to catch up with family the household otherwise saw only at holidays. A theme park, saved for and anticipated for months in advance, the actual day itself a blur of long lines, overpriced food, and a genuine, hard-won sense of magic that many people carried as a core childhood memory for the rest of their lives. A stretch of coastline, rented for a week in a modest beach house shared, not infrequently, with another family to help split the cost. The car itself became its own small, temporary universe for the duration of the drive. Snacks were rationed carefully, doled out at intervals to manage the inevitable, how much longer, refrain from the back seat. Cassette tapes, and by the later years of the decade, the earliest CDs, cycled through the car stereo on repeat until every family member could recite the lyrics without thinking. Arguments broke out over the invisible boundary line running down the middle of the back seat, an imaginary border more fiercely defended than most actual international borders. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, in the particular boredom and closeness of a long highway drive, families built a specific kind of memory that many would look back on, years later, with genuine and uncomplicated fondness. One of the few suburban rituals that seemed to deliver more or less exactly what it promised. Summer at home, for the weeks not spent traveling, settled into its own rhythm. Days stretched long and largely unstructured for children old enough to be left home, the television and the neighborhood pool filling hours that, in an earlier or later generation, might have been filled with organized camp or structured activity. Public pools became their own small social ecosystem, a place where an entire summer's worth of neighborhood friendships were built and occasionally ended over the course of a single afternoon. Lightning bugs were caught in mason jars with holes punched in the lid, released by bedtime more often than not, in accordance with a household rule about not keeping wild things trapped overnight. The ice cream truck's approaching jingle produced a very specific, universally recognized surge of urgency, sending children sprinting toward whichever parent happened to be holding a few loose dollar bills. Holidays and the machinery of seasonal perfection. The suburban calendar organized itself, in large part, around a handful of major holidays, each one carrying its own specific set of expectations, decorations, and quiet performance pressures layered on top of the underlying celebration itself. Halloween arrived first in the fall lineup, and it demanded, at minimum, a costume increasingly store-bought by the decade's end, though a meaningful number of households still leaned on homemade efforts assembled from whatever the closet and craft box could provide. The neighborhood itself transformed for a single evening into something closer to its advertised ideal, children moving in loose packs from door to door, parents trailing a respectful distance behind with flashlights, porch lights left on as a universally understood signal of participation. The candy inspection ritual described earlier ran alongside all of it. A low hum of parental vigilance layered over what was, for most children, simply one of the best nights of the year. Thanksgiving brought its own specific machinery. A full week, in many households, of planning and shopping, the good china brought down from a top cabinet used perhaps twice a year, extended family gathered around a table sized for an occasion rather than for daily use. The meal itself followed a nearly identical script from house to house across the entire country. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce from a can that held its cylindrical shape with an almost architectural precision, a green bean casserole built, once again, around a can of condensed soup. Football played on the television in the background for much of the afternoon, a low ambient soundtrack to conversation, and to whatever unspoken family tensions occasionally surfaced once the wine had been poured. Christmas represented, without much competition, the single largest seasonal production of the year. Decorations went up the weekend after Thanksgiving in a great many households, an entire garage's worth of storage bins finally put to their one annual use. Outdoor lights became their own quiet neighborhood competition, closely related in spirit to the lawn care rivalry described earlier. A house strung with an impressive, carefully synchronized display, drawing a slow trickle of cars from other neighborhoods entirely, parents driving their own children through to look. The presents themselves, purchased across weeks of careful budgeting and, not infrequently, a fair amount of credit card debt, were wrapped and arranged beneath a tree that had usually been debated at some length, real versus artificial, a decision that in some households carried more weight than seemed entirely proportional to a tree. And running beneath every one of these holidays sat the same underlying current present throughout the rest of suburban life. The pressure to make each occasion look, from the outside and increasingly for the photographs that would circulate afterward, entirely effortless and entirely joyful, regardless of what had actually gone into producing it, regardless of the argument that had briefly flared in the kitchen an hour before the guests arrived. The 6 o'clock news and the manufacturing of local fear. Every evening, somewhere around 6 o'clock, the suburban household gathered, sometimes literally, sometimes just within earshot from the kitchen, for the local news broadcast. And the local news broadcast had, by this point in the decade, refined a very particular formula for holding an audience's attention. If it bleeds, it leads, as the saying went inside newsrooms, and the suburb, despite being statistically one of the safer places a person could choose to live, absorbed a nightly diet of crime coverage, house fires, and cautionary consumer safety segments that left a lingering, disproportionate sense of danger lurking just beyond the cul-de-sac. A single carjacking on the far side of the metro area, covered in vivid, extended detail, could shape a week's worth of dinner-table conversation in a neighborhood 45 minutes away that had, statistically, nothing whatsoever to do with the incident. The broadcast's own graphics, flashing red banners, ominous synthesizer music cued for the crime segment, worked, deliberately, to heighten a sense of immediate personal threat that rarely matched the actual, underlying data about crime trends, which in most of the country were, by mid-decade, trending gently downward rather than up. Parents absorbed this nightly diet and, not unreasonably, adjusted their own behavior in response, tightening rules around how far children could ride their bikes, reinforcing the stranger danger warnings already deeply embedded in the culture, checking that doors were locked a little more consistently than in years past. The irony, rarely acknowledged at the time, was that the news itself functioned as its own kind of low-grade neighborhood surveillance report, delivered nightly into the living room, quietly training an entire generation of suburban parents to see danger as something arriving from outside the home, rather than statistically, as something far more likely to involve a car, a pool, or a household's own medicine cabinet. Neighborhood watch programs, formalized in many subdivisions during this decade, grew directly out of this same undercurrent. Laminated signs appeared at subdivision entrances, announcing that residents were watching. Volunteer patrols, organized loosely and meeting occasionally in someone's garage, drove slow evening loops through the same streets already thoroughly monitored by the blind-parting surveillance described earlier. A formalized, official version of the exact same instinct, channeling genuine community concern into a structure that occasionally did real good and occasionally shaded into the same low-grade suspicion of anything or anyone unfamiliar. Sunday mornings and the suburban congregation. For a great many suburban families, Sunday morning carried its own fixed rhythm, built around attendance at a local church, synagogue, or other house of worship that functioned as one of the few genuinely reliable, recurring points of real community contact available in an otherwise fairly isolated weekly schedule. Unlike the wave-through-a-windshield version of neighborliness described earlier, the community built around a congregation tended to involve actual sustained contact, a potluck after the service, a men's breakfast group meeting monthly before work, a women's Bible study rotating through different living rooms week to week, a youth group offering teenagers one of the only reliable, organized social outlets available to them outside of school hours. The suburban megachurch, an institution that grew substantially in scale and cultural footprint over the course of the decade, offered something the older, smaller downtown congregations increasingly struggled to match: ample free parking, a full slate of age-specific programming running simultaneously across a sprawling campus, contemporary music replacing traditional hymns in a growing number of services, and a general sense of scale and production value that mirrored, in some ways, the mall's own approach to drawing and holding a crowd. For families genuinely committed to regular attendance, the congregation often provided real, meaningful support during difficult stretches, A meal train organized quietly when a family welcomed a new baby or faced a medical crisis. A small group that noticed, gently, when someone had stopped showing up and reached out to check in. It stood, in a fairly direct sense, as one of the few institutions of the era actively working against the broader isolating tendencies of the subdivision itself, built as it was around the explicit expectation of showing up, in person, on a recurring weekly basis. At the same time, church culture carried its own version of the same performance pressure running through the rest of suburban life. Sunday best clothing, polished and pressed, a certain expected cheerfulness in the greeting line after the service. A family's private struggles, the same financial strain, the same marital tension, the same quiet unhappiness described in earlier segments, often received the identical treatment inside the church as outside it, carefully folded away before walking through the front doors, presented instead with the same practiced, pleasant version of "we're doing just fine, thanks for asking," extended to everyone else on the street. The suburban divorce rate and the new American family shape. Let's return briefly to a thread we touched on earlier, because it's worth sitting with a bit longer. The divorce rate in the United States had climbed substantially through the 1970s and 1980s before beginning to plateau, and in some measurements, gradually declined through the 1990s. But the cumulative effect of those earlier decades meant that, by the time this decade arrived, a meaningful share of suburban households looked noticeably different from the two-parent, single-income model the subdivisions themselves had originally been built around. Blended families became increasingly common across suburban neighborhoods. A step-parent, step-siblings, a school pickup schedule requiring careful coordination between two separate households, sometimes two separate towns. Single-parent households, overwhelmingly headed by mothers in this era, navigated the same car-dependent, service-scarce landscape described earlier with considerably less built-in support. The same lawn to maintain, the same commute to manage, often on a single income rather than two. The subdivision itself, architecturally, hadn't been designed with much flexibility for this shift. A split-level or colonial-style home built explicitly around the assumption of two parents and two-plus children didn't easily accommodate a single working parent managing everything alone, and a considerable amount of quiet, unglamorous labor, arranging after-school care, coordinating custody exchanges, managing a household budget stretched thinner than it had been designed for fell to parents navigating a built environment that had never really planned for their particular situation. And yet, for all the genuine strain this newer family shape produced, many of these households built their own resilient, functional versions of stability. New routines, new support networks assembled from extended family, church communities, or a small circle of similarly situated neighbors who understood from direct experience exactly what the logistics involved. The home computer arrives. Sometime in the middle of the decade, a new object began appearing on desks in suburban dens and spare bedrooms across the country. The home computer, bulky and beige, of course it was beige, humming quietly in a corner that had previously held a sewing machine or a stack of unread magazines. Early in the decade, it remained a relatively rare and expensive purchase, treated with a certain reverence, its floppy disks stored carefully in a small plastic case, its dial-up modem making a distinctive, screeching handshake, sound that an entire generation of children would instantly recognize decades later. By the back half of the decade, the home computer had moved from novelty to near necessity in a great many households, driven partly by growing awareness that children would need basic computer literacy for school and eventually for work, and partly by the arrival of dial-up internet access, sold through a handful of major providers whose promotional CDs seemed to arrive in the mailbox with almost comic frequency. Getting online required, for a period, tying up the household's single phone line entirely, a source of genuine household conflict when a teenager's hour-long internet session meant nobody else could receive an incoming call, a frustration compounded by the distinctive shrieking tone of the modem connecting, audible through the whole house. The computer itself occupied an interesting position in the home, often placed deliberately in a shared family space, a den or a corner of the living room, reflecting an early, somewhat unformed parental instinct that this new technology probably required a degree of supervision, even before anyone fully understood what exactly needed supervising. Educational software, sold in big-box brightly colored packaging, promised to teach typing skills, basic math, or geography through a simple animated game, occupying children for stretches of time in a manner not entirely unlike television, just with a slightly more interactive, slightly more parent-approved gloss to it. For the adults of the household, the computer's arrival carried its own quiet promise. A home-based side business finally made genuinely practical, a household budget finally trackable in a spreadsheet rather than a checkbook register, a long letter to distant family finally typed rather than handwritten. Nobody, in these early years, fully grasped how completely this humming beige machine would eventually reshape the fabric of daily suburban life. For the moment, in most households, it remained one more object among many, impressive, a little intimidating, tucked into a corner of a room otherwise still governed entirely by the television across from it. The secret economy of suburban kids. Beneath the adult economy of credit cards and mortgages, and keeping up with the Joneses, suburban children of this era ran their own smaller, scrappier economy. One built on lemonade stands, paper routes, lawn mowing jobs, and the reliable, ritualized fundraising drives organized through school and scouting programs. The lemonade stand held a particular, near-mythical status as a young child's first taste of commerce. A card table dragged to the end of the driveway, a hand-lettered sign propped against a stack of Dixie cups, prices set at a wildly optimistic 25 or 50 cents a cup, sales driven almost entirely by sympathetic neighbors and passing joggers rather than any genuine market demand. Profits, when they materialized at all, were modest, but the lesson embedded in the whole exercise, that effort could be exchanged for money, that a product needed to be made and marketed and sold, landed early, and for many kids, stuck for life. The paper route represented a considerably more serious commitment, typically taken on by kids a few years older, requiring a genuinely early alarm, well before dawn on weekdays, even earlier on Sunday mornings when the paper carried a bulkier stack of advertising inserts, and a bike modified with a canvas bag slung over the handlebars, heavy enough with rolled newspapers to make steering a genuine test of balance. Collecting payment from customers, often door to door once a month, taught its own quiet lessons in persistence, bookkeeping, and the specific awkwardness of asking an adult neighbor directly for money owed. Lawn mowing, for boys in particular though not exclusively, became a reliable summer income source in a neighborhood already deeply invested in lawn maintenance as a status marker. A kid with access to a working mower could often build a small, informal client list among neighbors too busy or too elderly to keep up with their own grass, charging a flat rate per yard that, by the standards of a 12-year-old's disposable income, felt like a genuine fortune. School and scouting fundraisers added their own recurring seasonal rhythm. Boxes of chocolate bars sold door to door for the marching band's new uniforms. Wrapping paper catalogs passed around the neighborhood each fall for the elementary school's playground equipment fund. Cookies sold by the case each spring by scout troops working a card table outside the grocery store entrance. Parents, inevitably, ended up absorbing a meaningful share of these sales themselves, buying a box or two out of their own child's inventory rather than watching them struggle to meet a stated quota, a quiet, widely understood open secret of the entire fundraising system. Beyond the candle party, other home businesses. The direct sales living room party covered earlier represented only one branch of a much broader suburban interest in home-based entrepreneurship during this decade. Home-based daycare represented a common and genuinely practical option for a neighborhood mother looking to earn income while remaining home with her own young children. A spare bedroom or finished basement converted into a small, informal daycare space. A handful of neighborhood children dropped off each morning by working parents grateful for a trusted, familiar, considerably more affordable alternative to a formal daycare center. Tutoring services, piano lessons offered out of a living room with an upright piano, positioned specifically for this purpose, seamstress work taken in for hemming and alterations. All represented quieter, less structurally exploitative versions of the same underlying suburban impulse toward home-based income, usually run by a single individual with a genuine skill, rather than requiring the recruitment structure of the larger direct sales operations. Garage sales deserve their own mention here as well, functioning as a kind of informal, periodic release valve for the very same accumulated garage clutter described in an earlier segment. A weekend garage sale, advertised with hand-lettered signs stapled to telephone poles at the subdivision's main entrances, brought a slow trickle of strangers and neighbors alike wandering through a driveway lined with folding tables, picking through years of accumulated possessions priced at $0.25 or $1. A small, temporary marketplace that briefly, genuinely connected a household to the wider community in a way most ordinary weekends never managed. Diet culture and the suburban body. The 1990s suburb carried its own particular set of expectations around health, fitness, and body image, transmitted primarily through magazine covers at the grocery store checkout line, daytime talk shows, and a steady rotation of exercise videos that occupied a permanent shelf near the television in a great many households. The decade inherited, and in some ways intensified, a cultural preoccupation with thinness that had been building for years, wrapped now in the language of wellness and self-improvement that made the underlying pressure feel less like vanity and more like personal responsibility. The home exercise video became its own minor suburban institution, presented by an impossibly energetic instructor in brightly colored spandex, promising visible results within a specific, optimistic number of weeks. These tapes circulated through neighborhoods much the way recipes and gossip did borrowed, copied onto blank cassettes, passed from one living room to the next, often accompanied by a genuine, if short-lived, burst of enthusiasm that tended to fade somewhere around week 3. The tape eventually joining the treadmill in the garage's growing collection of abandoned good intentions. Magazine covers at the checkout line ran a fairly relentless cycle of dieting advice, promising a specific transformation before an upcoming holiday or swimsuit season. Each issue's cover story somehow both urgent and completely interchangeable with the one from 3 months earlier. This steady drumbeat shaped, in quiet and not always healthy ways, how many suburban women in particular thought about food, weight, and their own bodies. An entire cultural apparatus built around the idea that a woman's body was a permanent, ongoing project requiring constant vigilance and correction. It's worth nomming honestly, without dwelling in specifics, that this cultural moment placed real and sometimes serious strain on people's relationship with food and their own bodies. A strain that, for some, extended into genuine struggle. If any of this touches something personal for you listening tonight, please know that support exists, and reaching out to a doctor or counselor is a strong, worthwhile step, not a small one. The suburban gym, when one existed within reasonable driving distance, offered its own social ecosystem. A place where a fairly narrow set of the neighborhood's more health-conscious residents crossed paths regularly, often before the workday began or immediately after the commute home, one more small pocket of genuine, recurring community tucked into an otherwise fairly isolated weekly schedule. The family doctor, and the suburban medical visit. Healthcare in the suburban household of this decade still largely revolved around a single, familiar family doctor, a practitioner who, in many cases, had treated multiple generations of the same family, whose office sat in a modest medical building a short drive from the subdivision, whose waiting room carried the same particular smell of antiseptic and old magazines in every town across the country. The annual physical, the back-to-school vaccination requirement, the after-hours phone call about a child's fever. These visits followed a fairly predictable rhythm, insurance permitting, and for households with reasonably comprehensive coverage through an employer, the system worked adequately well. For households without that coverage, or with a plan that covered considerably less than advertised, a single unexpected medical bill could land with genuine, lasting financial force, quietly adding to the same stack of unopened envelopes already sitting in the kitchen drawer. Medication advertising, meanwhile, was only just beginning to appear directly to consumers on television by the decade's later years, following a regulatory shift that would fully reshape the landscape in the years just ahead. An early hint of a cultural change in how households would eventually relate to prescription medication, moving gradually from something discussed quietly and only with a doctor toward something advertised, by name, during the evening news. Autumn and the ritual of the changing season. Autumn arrived in the suburb with its own distinctive set of rituals, layered on top of the raking and the Halloween preparations already covered. The falling leaves themselves became a genuine, recurring point of neighborhood tension. A homeowner's carefully maintained lawn now under quiet assault from a neighbor's oak tree, whose leaves drifted, entirely without permission, across the property line, prompting exactly the kind of low-grade dispute the HOA newsletter periodically addressed in its own careful, diplomatic language. The leaf blower, already established as the soundtrack of Saturday mornings in spring and summer, took on a new intensity in October and November, entire weekends organized around the steady, repetitive task of gathering leaves into large paper bags purchased specifically for the purpose, or into enormous piles eventually raked to the curb for municipal collection. Children, for their part, treated the leaf pile less as yard waste and more as recreational equipment, diving into a freshly raked pile with an enthusiasm that undid, in about 4 seconds, 20 minutes of a parent's careful work. A small, recurring domestic drama repeated in yard after yard across the neighborhood each fall. High school football, in towns large enough to support it, became its own genuine autumn institution, Friday night lights drawing a meaningful cross-section of the community to metal bleachers. A shared, recurring social event that, unlike so much of suburban life described in earlier segments, actually did bring neighbors into real, sustained proximity, cheering together, genuinely invested in the same outcome for a few hours at a stretch. Winter and the long indoor stretch. Winter closed the suburb in on itself in a different way than any other season. Shorter days meant Dad's commute now happened almost entirely in darkness, leaving before sunrise and returning well after sunset, the daylight hours of his own workday bookended by headlights in both directions. Snow, in the regions that received it, brought its own particular suburban ritual, the shoveled driveway as one more small, visible marker of a household keeping up appropriately, a task tackled early enough in the morning to avoid any implied judgment from neighbors already out clearing their own walks. Indoor time stretched considerably longer during these months, and with it, television consumption climbed, board games came down from closet shelves, and the specific, confined boredom of a snow day home from school settled over a household for an unplanned, unstructured stretch of hours. The fireplace, where a house had one, took on an outsized role in the household's evening routine, a genuine focal point around which a family might actually gather in a way the television, for all its dominance, rarely quite replicated. How the suburb handled loss. It's worth pausing gently on a subject the neighborhood rarely discussed directly: how a suburban community handled genuine loss when it came. A death in the family produced, almost immediately, the same casserole ritual described earlier in the context of divorce. A steady, well-meaning procession of full-covered dishes left on a doorstep by neighbors who understood, instinctively, that showing up with food was one of the few universally acceptable ways to express care without requiring an awkward, extended conversation about grief itself. The funeral home, typically located in an older part of town rather than within the subdivision itself, hosted a viewing conducted with a formality that mirrored, in its own way, the broader suburban instinct toward composed, presentable appearances even in the rawest of circumstances. Sympathy cards arrived by mail in a steady stream for a week or two, each one a small, sincere gesture, and then, gradually, the outward attention faded back to normal, leaving the grieving family to continue processing a loss the neighborhood had, for the most part, moved on from. Grief, much like the marital strain and financial struggle covered earlier, tended to get folded quietly behind the same closed front door once the initial wave of casseroles and cards had passed. A private process carried largely alone, or within the immediate family, rather than something the wider community continued actively supporting once the funeral itself had concluded. If loss is something you're carrying tonight, please be gentle with yourself, and know that reaching out to someone, a friend, a counselor, a support line, is a genuinely good and worthwhile step whenever you're ready for it. What the dream actually delivered. So here you are, at the end of this long, quiet walk through a decade, standing in your imagination on a lawn you have poured your Saturdays into, behind a fence that keeps the world politely at a comfortable distance, in a house that looks from the street like every other house on the block. And maybe you feel it now, that faint hollowness around the edges of a dream that was sold as the finish line, the reward for all the effort, safety, space, and belonging, all promised in a single glossy brochure. And it's worth being fair here, genuinely fair, because the story doesn't resolve into a simple verdict. The dream did deliver something real. Consider what it had actually promised on its own terms, because the promises themselves were never foolish ones. Safety, a place to raise children somewhat removed from the more concentrated dangers of a crowded city center. Space, a house that was genuinely, entirely yours, a yard with room enough to breathe and to grow into. Belonging, a community of people who had, broadly, chosen a similar life, a neighborhood where you were meant to feel you'd finally arrived. These are among the most human things a person can want. And here is the honest, complicated part. The suburb did, in fact, deliver on a meaningful share of it. Children genuinely did grow up with yards to run through and streets, in most cases, considerably safer than many available alternatives. Families genuinely did have more physical space than most people, in most historical periods, had ever had reliable access to. There were real good days woven through all of this: summer barbecues that were actually, unambiguously fun. Neighbors who did, over years, become genuine friends rather than merely familiar waves through a windshield. A quiet, real satisfaction in owning a home that truly belonged to you and no one else. It would be dishonest, and a little unfair to the millions of people who genuinely built good lives here, to pretend the suburb was nothing but an elaborate trap. But the good, as we've walked through together tonight, came bundled with a price the brochure never itemized, and that price was genuinely steep. The debt that quietly financed so much of the performance, credit cards and mortgages, and the endless, exhausting effort of keeping pace with neighbors running the identical race. The isolation engineered, almost accidentally, into the very layout of the place itself, the attached garages, the privacy fences, the waves that so rarely deepened into actual conversation. The exhaustion of the long commute, the labor of constant home and lawn maintenance, the sheer sustained effort required simply to keep the whole machine running smoothly. And beneath all of it, running underneath nearly every segment we've covered tonight. The quiet, unrelenting, genuinely exhausting full-time work of appearing fine, of maintaining the surface, of keeping the real difficulty carefully behind the door. That performance, in the end, may have been the heaviest weight of all, because it was so nearly universal and so profoundly lonely in its universality. Everyone, in their own house, on their own lawn, was quietly performing the exact same contentment for an audience that was, itself, performing the identical contentment right back. A wide, beige hall of mirrors in which almost no one could ever be entirely certain who around them was genuinely all right, and who was simply, skillfully, pretending. Because pretending, in the end, turned out to be the one truly universal skill of the entire decade, practiced by nearly everyone, and admitted to by almost no one. So here you are, at the end of the day, standing in a house that looks like every other house, on a lawn you have poured so many Saturdays into, behind a fence that keeps the world at a polite, comfortable distance. And you feel the weight of it, the gap between what was promised on the brochure and what actually arrived in the mail in the driveway. In the quiet hours after the guests went home, the dream was real. That's precisely what makes the whole story so complicated. It was never exactly a lie, just a partial truth, sold gently and persuasively as though it were the complete one. A genuine set of comforts, wrapped tightly around a genuine set of costs, offered in good faith to millions of hopeful families who signed the papers, and mowed the lawns and smiled for the Christmas cards, and did their honest, sincere best to be happy inside all of it. Some of them were. Many of them were, at least some of the time. And nearly all of them, on certain quiet evenings, standing more or less exactly where you're standing now in your imagination, felt the particular weight of a dream that turned out to be considerably heavier to carry than anyone had ever quite thought to mention out loud. So how was your stay in the 90s suburbs tonight? You woke up in a house that looked exactly like every other house on the street. You mowed a lawn that, in its own quiet way, ruled entire weekends of your life. You dodged a formally worded letter from a homeowners association that measured your grass height with an actual tape measure. You kept pace with the Joneses until the credit card statements piled up, unopened, in a kitchen drawer. You waved at neighbors you never quite got to know, smiled through 45 minutes for a Christmas card, and carried an entire year of quiet trouble behind a closed front door. You drove home along roads with no sidewalks, to a garage too full of good intentions to hold the actual car. And here is the thing worth carrying with you as you finally drift off tonight. They were, nearly all of them, doing their honest best. The tired father, asleep in the recliner with a plate still balanced on his chest. The mother quietly holding the entire performance together, one steady day at a time. The latchkey child, learning to be brave in an empty, waiting house. The neighbor throwing one more living room gathering, hopping to move one more box of unsold inventory. They reached, all of them, for safety and space and belonging, and they paid for it across the years, in debt and quiet distance and a very particular kind of exhaustion. And still, on the good days and the good moments scattered generously enough through it all, they found something real. A barbecue that was genuinely, uncomplicatedly fun. A neighbor who slowly, over years, became something closer to family. A summer afternoon that felt, briefly and unmistakably, like the dream had actually come true. Because that, in the end, is the stubborn, enduring truth sitting underneath this entire story. People will always reach for a better life, even when that better life turns out to be considerably heavier to hold than any brochure ever promised. They will mow the lawn. They will smile for the card. They will keep gently pretending, quietly hopping the pretending eventually becomes real on its own. So tonight, as you settle in under your own blankets behind your own door, wherever that door happens to be, maybe let the performance rest for just a little while. You don't have to appear fine here in this particular moment. You can simply, finally, let yourself rest. Sleep well.